A widowed cowboy sat alone in a frozen cabin with his starving newborn, 2 weeks after burying his wife, when a knock shattered the silence. The stranger at his door would change everything. This is the story of Caleb Monroe, a broken man who lost his will to live, until one schoolteacher's act of kindness in a Wyoming blizzard proved that sometimes salvation arrives when you least expect it. Stay with me until the end, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The wind didn't just blow across the Wyoming frontier that January night, it attacked. It clawed at the log walls of Caleb Monroe's cabin like a living thing desperate to get inside, howling through every crack and crevice with a sound that might have been the voice of winter itself, angry and unforgiving. The shutters rattled against their hinges. The roof beams groaned under the weight of accumulating snow. And inside that small, isolated structure 5 miles from the nearest neighbor, a baby cried. Grace Monroe was 3 months old, though she'd only known her mother for the first moments of her life. Elena had held her daughter once, smiled through tears of exhaustion and joy, whispered, "My beautiful girl," and then slipped away as the midwife worked frantically to stop the bleeding that wouldn't stop. That had been 14 days ago. 14 days that felt like 14 years to the man who now paced the cabin floor with the wailing infant in his arms. Caleb Monroe had been a cowboy all his adult life, comfortable with horses and cattle, skilled with a rope and rifle, capable of surviving the harshest conditions the West could throw at him. But this tiny, fragile creature in his arms had reduced him to helplessness. Her cries were different tonight, not the angry squalls of a baby with a wet diaper or the fussy protests of tiredness, but something more primal, more desperate, hunger. She was hungry, and he had nothing to give her. "Shh, Grace, shh, baby girl." His voice was hoarse from 2 weeks of grief and exhaustion. He rocked her mechanically, the same motion he'd performed 10,000 times since Elena died, but nothing he did could comfort her now. Her tiny face was red and scrunched, her mouth opening and closing like a baby bird seeking food that wasn't there. The milk had gone bad. He tried to keep it cool in the root cellar, but something had happened. Maybe the temperature wasn't right. Maybe he'd contaminated it somehow with his clumsy attempts at feeding. That morning, when he'd warmed it and brought it to Grace's lips, she'd taken one taste and turned away, crying. He'd smelled it then, sour, spoiled, useless. He'd poured it out behind the cabin, watching the white stream disappear into the snow, and felt the first real fingers of panic close around his heart. There was more milk in town, of course. Fresh milk from the Henderson Dairy, condensed milk at Morrison's General Store, wet nurses who could help. But town was 8 miles away through this blizzard, and the road, if you could even call it that, was impassable. He'd tried that afternoon saddling Thunder, his most reliable horse, wrapping himself in every layer he owned. They'd made it perhaps a quarter mile before the snow became too deep, the wind too blinding. Thunder had balked, sensing the danger even if Caleb's desperation made him reckless. He'd turned back, defeated, to find Grace screaming in her cradle. Now it was night. The storm had intensified, and his daughter was starving. Caleb moved to the window, holding Grace against his shoulder, her cries vibrating through his chest. Through the frost-covered glass, he could see nothing but white chaos, snow driving horizontally, erasing the world beyond. The fence posts he knew were 30 yards from the cabin were invisible. The barn where Thunder and the 2 milk cows sheltered was a dark blur. Everything familiar had been swallowed by winter's rage. "I don't know what to do," he said to the empty room, to the ghost of his wife, to God if he was listening. "Elena, I need you. She needs you. I don't know how to do this alone." The cabin answered him with silence, broken only by Grace's weakening cries. Even her protests were losing strength now, becoming whimpers. Was that better or worse? He didn't know. He knew horses, damn it. He knew cattle. He didn't know babies. The cupboards were nearly bare. He'd let everything slip after Elena died. Before, she'd kept the house. Not because he expected it, but because she'd enjoyed it, had taken pride in their small home. She'd canned vegetables from their summer garden, baked bread that filled the cabin with warmth and the smell of yeast, made stews that could last for days. She'd been the heart of this place, and when that heart stopped beating, everything had slowly begun to die. Caleb looked now at what remained. A half loaf of stale bread, some dried beans that would take hours to cook, a few strips of jerky, Flour that might make hardtack if he had the energy to try. Nothing a 3-month-old baby could eat. Nothing that could save his daughter. He sank into his chair by the fireplace, the same chair where Elena used to nurse Grace, where she'd hum old songs from her childhood in Ohio. The fire was burning low. He should add more wood, but the effort seemed monumental. Grace had stopped crying now, had gone ominously quiet against his chest. He could feel her tiny heart beating, fast and fragile like a bird's. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her soft hair. "I'm so sorry, baby girl. I'm failing you, just like I failed your mama." That wasn't true, not exactly. Elena's death hadn't been his fault. The midwife had said as much, had explained about hemorrhaging and complications that even a city doctor might not have prevented, but truth and guilt didn't always align. He'd brought Elena to this harsh country, to this isolated cabin. He'd made her pregnant. He'd watched helplessly as she bled to death on their marriage bed while their daughter took her first breaths. If he'd been stronger, smarter, better, maybe she'd still be alive. And now their daughter would die too, because he couldn't even manage the simple task of feeding her. The wind screamed louder, and for a moment Caleb thought he heard something else, a sound beneath the storm's fury. But no, impossible. His mind was playing tricks, conjuring hope where there was none. They were alone out here, had been alone since the neighbors who'd come for Elena's funeral had trudged back to their own homes and lives. The Hendersons were 3 miles east, the Johansons 4 miles west, the town 8 miles north. In good weather, not so far. Tonight, they might as well be on different continents. Grace stirred against him, making a small sound of distress. Her lips moved in the instinctive sucking motion, seeking sustenance that didn't exist. Caleb felt something break inside his chest, not dramatically, not with any great snap, but quietly, the way ice cracks under gradual pressure. He'd been holding himself together these past 2 weeks through sheer stubbornness, moving through each day like a man wading through deep water. But this was too much. This was watching his daughter starve while he sat powerless. "What do you want me to do?" he asked the ceiling, the heavens beyond it. "Tell me what to do and I'll do it. Anything. Just don't take her too. Please don't take her too." The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney. The wind continued its assault. And then, there it was again. That sound. Not imagined this time, but real. 3 sharp knocks on the cabin door. Caleb's head jerked up. He stared at the door as if it might be a hallucination, but the knocks came again, more urgent. And then a voice, muffled by the wind but distinctly female. "Hello, Mr. Monroe? Are you there?" He was on his feet before conscious thought, moving to the door with Grace cradled in one arm. His hand hesitated on the latch. Who would be out in this storm? What kind of fool or desperate person would be traveling tonight? For one irrational moment, grief and exhaustion made him wonder if it was Elena's ghost, come back to help with their daughter. But Ghost didn't knock, and that voice, he knew that voice, though he couldn't immediately place it. Caleb threw the bolt and pulled the door open, and the wind nearly ripped it from his hand. Snow swirled into the cabin like a living thing, and there on his threshold stood a woman bundled in a heavy coat and scarf, snow covering her shoulders and clinging to her eyelashes. She held a large basket in both arms, and her face, what he could see of it above the scarf, was red from cold but animated with urgency. "Thank God," she said, her voice shaking. "I was afraid I'd taken the wrong turn. May I come in? Quickly, before we all freeze." Caleb stepped back, too shocked to do anything else. The woman hurried inside, and he pushed the door closed against the wind, throwing the bolt again. For a moment, they both just stood there in the sudden relative quiet, snow melting off her coat and forming puddles on the floor, their breaths visible in the cold air. "Miss Bennett?" Caleb finally managed. "Yes." She unwrapped the scarf from her face, revealing features he now recognized. Nora Bennett, the new schoolteacher who'd come to Pine Hollow Valley the previous fall. He'd met her once, briefly, at the Harvest Social. Elena had chatted with her while he'd stood awkwardly nearby, never good with social gatherings. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair now plastered to her forehead from snow and exertion and eyes that looked almost black in the firelight. How did you... He couldn't form a complete question. The shock was too great. Nora set the basket on his table and began unbuttoning her coat with fingers that were clumsy from cold. I brought supplies, food, milk for the baby. She glanced at Grace, still clutched to Caleb's chest, and her expression softened. How is she? Hungry? Caleb said, the word coming out rough. The milk went bad. I tried to get to town, but the storm… I know. Nora shrugged off her coat, hanging it on the peg by the door. Underneath, she wore a simple dress that was damp around the hem. Mrs. Henderson told me. She was worried about you both, said you'd come by 3 days ago looking terrible, and that the baby was crying something fierce. When the storm hit, she asked if I'd check on you. I was staying with the Hendersons while schools closed for winter. They're good people, always taking in strays like me. She smiled, but it was brief, focused quickly back on the basket. I would have come sooner, but the storm was too dangerous even yesterday. Today felt like now or never. Caleb watched in stunned silence as she unpacked the basket with efficient movements. A glass bottle of fresh milk, a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, a jar of what looked like applesauce, some cheese, dried meat, vegetables. It was more food than he'd seen in his cabin since before Elena died. You traveled 3 miles in this blizzard, he said slowly, trying to understand. Alone. To bring us food. Nora glanced at him, and something flickered across her face. Was it embarrassment? Mrs. Henderson wanted to come herself, but her rheumatism has been terrible in this cold. Her husband couldn't leave the dairy, and I… She paused, turning her attention back to the basket. I'm young and stupid enough to think I could make it, which I did, so perhaps not as stupid as all that. She pulled out the bottle of milk and held it up to the firelight, examining it. This is fresh from this morning. It should be fine, though it's probably cold now. Do you have a pot? We should warm it. I'll do it. Caleb moved toward her, but Grace chose that moment to let out a weak, plaintive cry, and he stopped. No, you tend to her. Nora was already moving to the fireplace, scanning the cabin with quick, assessing eyes. She located a small pot hanging on a hook, poured milk into it, and positioned it near the fire. Does she take a bottle, or have you been… She paused delicately. Bottle, Caleb said. Elena only nursed her for the first day before… He couldn't finish. Nora nodded, understanding in her expression. Where is it? Caleb gestured to the table, where the bottle sat in a pathetic attempt at cleanliness, washed but probably not well. Nora collected it, examined it, and then moved to a bucket of water by the door. The one Caleb had filled that morning from the pump, breaking through a layer of ice to do it. She washed the bottle again, more thoroughly, all her movements quick and competent. You've done this before, Caleb observed. I have 6 younger siblings, Nora said without turning. I've fed more babies than I can count. It's just milk and patience, really, and love, but I suspect you have plenty of that. The casual kindness in her words hit Caleb harder than any sympathy he'd received at Elena's funeral. He sank back into his chair, Grace stirring restlessly in his arms, and watched the stranger move through his cabin like she belonged there, rescuing them both from his own inadequacy. The milk warmed quickly. Nora tested its temperature on her wrist, a gesture so practiced it looked like instinct, and then poured it into the bottle. She crossed to Caleb, kneeling beside his chair. May I? She asked, reaching for Grace. Caleb hesitated only a moment before transferring his daughter into the schoolteacher's arms. Nora settled into position with the ease of experience, cradling Grace in the crook of her left arm while bringing the bottle to those desperately searching lips with her right hand. Grace latched onto the bottle with an intensity that was almost violent, her tiny hands coming up to grip it, her whole body taut with need. She sucked frantically, milk disappearing at an alarming rate. Easy, sweetheart, Nora murmured. Not so fast, or you'll make yourself sick. There's plenty, I promise. Nobody's going to take it away. But Grace was beyond reason, beyond anything except the desperate drive to fill her empty stomach. Nora let her drink for a minute, then gently pulled the bottle away despite Grace's immediate protest. I know, Nora soothed, but you need to burp or you'll have a terrible tummy ache. She lifted Grace to her shoulder, patting her back with practiced gentleness. Caleb watched, feeling useless and grateful in equal measure. I should know how to do that, he said quietly. I should know all of this. Nora glanced at him, her expression impossible to read in the flickering firelight. You're doing the best you can. That's all anyone can do. My best isn't good enough. She was starving, and I couldn't. But she's not starving now. Nora's voice was firm, but not unkind. And you tried to get help. You tried to reach town in a blizzard, Mr. Monroe. Mrs. Henderson said Thunder came back with icicles in his mane. That's not a man who gave up. Grace burped, a sound comically loud from such a small person. Nora smiled and brought the bottle back to her lips, letting her drink again. This time, Grace fed more slowly, some of the desperation easing as her stomach began to fill. Caleb leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and put his face in his hands. He was not a man who cried, had been taught from boyhood that tears were weakness, that men endured, but the relief was overwhelming. His daughter was eating. She would be all right. For tonight, at least, she would be all right. Thank you, he managed, the words muffled. Miss Bennett, I can't. Then don't try, Nora said simply. Just accept the help that's offered. There's no shame in needing people, Mr. Monroe. We weren't meant to face everything alone. They sat in silence then, broken only by the sounds of the storm outside and Grace's rhythmic sucking. The fire crackled and popped. The cabin, which had felt like a tomb for the past 2 weeks, suddenly felt almost warm, almost like a home. Grace finished the bottle, and Nora burped her again. The baby's eyes were drooping now, her belly full for the first time in too many hours. But when Nora tried to lay her in the cradle near the fireplace, Grace startled awake, whimpering. It's all right, Nora whispered, lifting her back up. You're safe, little one. I've got you. She began to hum, a low, wordless melody that might have been a lullaby or might have been nothing in particular. She swayed gently, rocking Grace in her arms, and after a few minutes, the baby's eyes closed again. This time, when Nora laid her in the cradle, Grace stayed asleep, her breathing deep and even. Nora stood, stretching slightly, and turned to face Caleb. For the first time since her arrival, she seemed to really look at him, taking in his appearance with undisguised concern. When did you last eat? She asked. Caleb tried to remember. Breakfast, maybe? Some of that stale bread? Or had that been yesterday? Time had become strange since Elena died, the days blurring together into one long stretch of gray exhaustion. I'm not hungry, he said, which wasn't entirely true, but felt true enough. That wasn't what I asked. Nora moved back to the basket, pulling out the bread and cheese. Grief isn't an excuse to stop taking care of yourself, Mr. Monroe. You have a daughter who needs you alive and strong. It should have sounded preachy, but somehow it didn't. Maybe because she was already slicing the bread with his knife, laying out cheese and some of the dried meat, preparing a meal without asking permission. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She set a plate on the table and looked at him expectantly. But I'm going to anyway. Come eat. Caleb found himself obeying, too worn down to argue. He sat at the table, the same table where Elena used to serve dinner, where they'd shared countless meals and conversations and quiet moments. The memory should have hurt, but somehow, with this stranger moving efficiently through his kitchen space, it didn't feel as sharp as usual. Nora poured water from the bucket into 2 cups and sat across from him. She'd made herself a plate too, he noticed. Eat, she said again, when he just stared at the food. You'll feel better with something in your stomach. He picked up the bread, bit into it mechanically. It was good, fresh, with butter baked into it. Nothing like the stale stuff in his cupboard. He ate another bite, then another, and suddenly he was ravenous, his body recognizing its own neglect. He ate everything on the plate, then looked up sheepishly to find Nora watching him with satisfaction. Better? She asked. Yeah. He was surprised to realize it was true. The fog in his head had lifted slightly, the weakness in his limbs easing. Thank you. You're welcome. She ate her own food more slowly, her eyes moving around the cabin. Caleb tried to see it through her eyes and felt shame creep up his neck. Dishes piled in the basin, unswept floors, ash overflowing from the fireplace, his clothes in a heap in the corner. The place was a disaster. I've let things go, he said, unnecessarily. You've been grieving, Nora corrected. There's a difference. She finished her bread and stood, collecting both plates. The storm's getting worse. I can hear it. Caleb listened. She was right. The wind had intensified, the cabin walls groaning under the assault. He moved to the window, peering out into pure darkness now. Nothing was visible except the occasional glimpse of snow in the reflected firelight. "You can't go back out in this," he said, turning to face her. "You'll freeze before you make it 100 yards." Nora had started washing the dishes in the bucket of water, her back to him. Her shoulders stiffened slightly. "I brought a lantern, and I know the way." "No." The word came out more forcefully than he'd intended. "Miss Bennett, I'm grateful, more grateful than I can say, but I can't let you go out there. It's suicide." "Mr. Monroe, it's past dark now, the storm's worse, and you'd be walking into wind that can knock a grown man down." Caleb crossed to her, and she turned to face him. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her face, the way her hands were still trembling slightly from cold or exertion. "You saved my daughter's life tonight. I won't repay that by letting you die trying to get home." They stood there in a strange standoff, this man and woman who barely knew each other, arguing over an act of self-destruction neither would name. "I can't stay here," Nora said finally. "It wouldn't be proper. People would talk." "People will understand. This is a blizzard, not a social call." "You don't know how people talk, Mr. Monroe, especially about unmarried women." Caleb felt a flash of anger, not at her, but at a world where propriety mattered more than survival. "I know that I'd rather face gossip than have your death on my conscience. Please, Miss Bennett, stay until the storm breaks. You can have my bed, and I'll sleep out here by the fire with Grace." Nora looked at him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her dark eyes. Then she sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. "Just until morning. As soon as there's light and the wind dies down, I'll go." "Fair enough." Caleb felt relief wash through him. "I'll get you some blankets." He moved to the chest at the foot of his bed. Elena's chest, filled with the quilts she'd made and the linens she'd kept so carefully. He pulled out the warmest blanket, trying not to think about the last time these had been used, the last time Elena had slept beneath them. When he returned to the main room, Nora was standing by Grace's cradle, looking down at the sleeping baby with an expression Caleb couldn't quite read. Tender, yes, but also something else. Longing? Sorrow? "She's beautiful," Nora said softly, not looking up. "She has your eyes, I think, and her mother's nose." "You remember Elena?" "We only spoke once at the Harvest Social, but she was kind to me, one of the few people who was when I first came to the valley." Nora finally looked at him. "She told me about the baby, how excited she was, how you were building a bigger cabin for when the family grew." Her voice caught slightly. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Mr. Monroe. She seemed like a wonderful woman." Caleb had heard countless expressions of sympathy since the funeral, but this one, for some reason, felt different. Maybe because Nora had known Elena, however briefly. Maybe because she'd risked her life to come here. Maybe just because he was too tired to keep his walls up. "She was," he said simply, "the best woman I've ever known." They stood together in the warm silence, watching the baby sleep, and for the first time since Elena died, Caleb didn't feel entirely alone. After a moment, Nora shook herself slightly, as if waking from a reverie. "You should rest too, Mr. Monroe. You look like you haven't slept properly in weeks." "I haven't," he admitted. "Grace wakes every few hours, and even when she's quiet, I lie there listening, making sure she's still breathing." "Then let me watch her tonight." Nora held up a hand when he started to protest. "I'm already awake, and honestly, I'm still too cold and too wound up from the journey to sleep yet. I'll sit by the fire, keep it fed, and wake you if she needs anything. You take your bed and actually rest." "I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm offering." Her tone left no room for argument. "Consider it part of the rescue mission. A starving baby does no one any good, but neither does a father who collapses from exhaustion." She had a point, and Caleb was too worn down to keep arguing. "All right, but wake me when you get tired. We can take shifts." "Deal." Caleb moved toward his bedroom, then paused at the doorway. "Miss Bennett, thank you for everything. I don't know how to—" "Then don't try," she said again, settling into his chair by the fire. "Just sleep, Mr. Monroe. Tomorrow will come soon enough." He nodded and went into the bedroom, closing the door partway. He didn't bother undressing, just lay down on top of the blankets, still wearing his work clothes and boots. The bed felt too big, too empty, haunted by memories of Elena's warmth beside him. But exhaustion was stronger than grief tonight, and within minutes, for the first time in 2 weeks, Caleb Monroe fell into deep, dreamless sleep. In the main room, Nora Bennett added wood to the fire and settled in for her vigil. She looked at the sleeping baby, at the closed bedroom door, and then out at the storm still raging beyond the windows. She thought about the journey she'd just made, 3 miles through blinding snow, following fence posts when she could find them and pure instinct when she couldn't. She'd been afraid, more afraid than she'd let anyone see, but she'd kept moving because a baby needed help and a man was drowning in grief. She hadn't told him the full truth, that Mrs. Henderson had mentioned the situation 3 days ago, and Nora had been planning to visit ever since, storm or no storm. That she'd been thinking about Elena Monroe, about their brief conversation at the Harvest Social, where Elena had sensed something in Nora's story that no one else had asked about. That when Elena had asked, gently, why a woman with a Boston education had come west to teach in a nowhere town like Pine Hollow Valley, Nora had almost told her the truth about the broken engagement, the shame, the need to disappear. She hadn't told Caleb that she understood grief intimately, that she'd lost someone too, though in a different way, that sometimes helping others was easier than facing your own pain. Grace stirred in her cradle, making a small sound, and Nora reached over to rock it gently. The baby settled, and Nora began to hum again, that same wordless melody, watching the fire burn and listening to the storm rage outside. She didn't know what morning would bring, but for tonight, in this small cabin on the frozen frontier, 3 broken people, a grieving father, a starving baby, and a woman running from her past, had found a moment of peace. The wind screamed, the fire crackled, and in the bedroom, Caleb Monroe slept without nightmares for the first time since his wife had died, while a woman he barely knew kept watch over his daughter and waited for the dawn. Caleb woke to the smell of coffee. For a moment, suspended between sleep and waking, he thought Elena was in the kitchen, that the past 2 weeks had been the nightmare, and this was reality, his wife humming while she prepared breakfast, their daughter safe in her cradle, the world still whole. Then full consciousness returned with the weight of a stone, and he remembered. Elena was gone. Grace had been starving, and there had been a knock in the storm. He sat up quickly, disoriented by the fact that he'd slept at all, much less through what felt like the entire night. Gray light filtered through the bedroom window, dawn or close to it. The storm's howl had diminished to a steady wind, no longer the furious assault of the previous evening. And from the main room came sounds he hadn't heard in this cabin for far too long. The clink of dishes, the crackle of a well-tended fire, and underneath it all, blessed silence. No crying baby, no hungry wails, just peace. Caleb stood, his body protesting the movement. He'd slept in his clothes, and they were rumpled and uncomfortable, but that hardly mattered. He moved to the door, opening it slowly, and stopped in the doorway at the sight before him. Nora Bennett stood at his stove, still wearing yesterday's dress, though she'd rolled up the sleeves, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. She was stirring something in a pot, oatmeal, from the smell of it, and the coffee he'd detected was steaming in Elena's blue tin pot. The dishes from last night were clean and stacked. The floor had been swept, the ash had been cleared from the fireplace, and a fresh, strong fire burned. And there, in the cradle, Grace slept peacefully. Her tiny face relaxed in a way he hadn't seen since before Elena died. Nora turned at the sound of his movement, and a quick smile crossed her face. "Good morning. I hope I didn't wake you." "No, Caleb ran a hand through his hair, suddenly aware of how he must look, unshaven, unwashed, thoroughly disreputable. "What time is it?" "Just past 7, I'd guess. The storm broke about an hour ago." She gestured to the window, and he saw that while snow still fell, it was gentle now, almost peaceful. The world beyond the glass was buried in white, drifts piled high against the cabin walls, but the violent fury of last night had passed. "You've been up all night." "Most of it." Nora turned back to the oatmeal, stirring it with practiced efficiency. Grace woke twice, once around midnight, once around 4. I fed her both times. The second feeding, she went right back to sleep, which seemed like a good sign. I think she was just so exhausted from all that crying yesterday. Caleb moved into the room, drawn toward the cradle. He knelt beside it, looking down at his daughter. Grace's tiny fist was curled near her mouth. her chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of healthy sleep. Relief so intense it was almost painful washed through him. "I should have been the one to feed her," he said quietly. "That's my job, not yours." "Your job was to sleep," Nora replied, her tone allowing no argument. "Which you clearly needed, or you wouldn't have been out for nearly 10 hours straight." 10 hours? Caleb looked at her, shocked. He couldn't remember the last time he'd slept more than 2 or 3 hours at a stretch. "At least. I heard you snoring around midnight." There was a hint of amusement in her voice, but no judgment. "It's ready. Come eat while it's hot." She ladled oatmeal into 2 bowls, adding a spoonful of honey to each from a small jar she'd produced from that seemingly bottomless basket. Caleb sat at the table feeling strangely like a guest in his own home, and accepted the bowl she set before him. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, gesturing vaguely at the clean cabin, the food, everything. Nora settled into the chair across from him with her own bowl. "I know, but I was awake anyway, and idle hands make for a restless mind. Besides, it needed doing." She took a bite of oatmeal, then continued. "I hope you don't mind that I poked through your cupboards. I was trying to take inventory of what you have, what you'll need when I go back to the Hendersons." "When you go back?" Caleb repeated the words, and something uncomfortable settled in his chest. Of course she would go back. Why wouldn't she? She'd done what she came to do, brought food, kept them alive through the night. She had her own life to return to. "I should leave soon, actually." Nora glanced toward the window. "The snow's light enough now that I can make it back safely. Mrs. Henderson will be worried. I told her I'd return by morning, and it's already—" "Wait." Caleb set down his spoon. "You can't just— the road's still buried. There's 3 feet of snow out there, maybe more. I managed last night in worse conditions. Last night was insane. You could have died." "But I didn't." Nora's expression was calm, matter of fact. "And I know the way now. I can follow my own tracks back, at least part way." Caleb shook his head, frustration building. "Miss Bennett, I can't let you— You keep saying that. I can't let you. But Mr. Monroe, I'm not yours to let or not let. I'm a grown woman, perfectly capable of making my own decisions." It was a fair point, and one he had no good counter for. But the thought of her heading back out into that frozen wasteland, alone, made something twist in his gut. "At least wait until it stops snowing completely, and let me hitch up the sleigh, take you back properly. It's the least I can do after everything you've done for us." Nora considered this, tilting her head slightly. "You have a sleigh?" "In the barn. Nothing fancy, but it's sturdy. Thunder can pull it easily enough." "And you'd be willing to make the trip? It's 6 miles round trip in this weather." "After what you did for Grace?" Caleb met her eyes directly. "Miss Bennett, I'd drive you to California if you asked." A flush crept up Nora's cheeks, and she looked down at her oatmeal. "That won't be necessary. But if you're truly willing, then yes, I'd appreciate the ride. It would be safer than trying to walk." Then it's settled. Caleb felt a small measure of relief. At least this way he could ensure she made it back safely, could see with his own eyes that she reached the Henderson place without freezing or getting lost. "We'll leave after breakfast. Give the weather a bit more time to clear." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, and Caleb found himself stealing glances at this woman across his table. In the gray morning light, he could see details he'd missed the night before. The fine lines at the corners of her eyes that suggested she smiled often, or had once. The slight calluses on her hands from work, surprising in a schoolteacher. The way she held herself with a quiet confidence that spoke of inner strength. "Tell me something," Caleb said suddenly. "Why did you really come? Last night, in that storm? Mrs. Henderson being worried is one thing, but 3 miles through a blizzard? That's crazy," Nora supplied, a slight smile playing at her lips. "I was going to say uncommonly brave, but crazy works too." Nora set down her spoon, her expression growing more serious. "Your wife was kind to me, Mr. Monroe. When I first came to Pine Hollow Valley, most people treated me like a curiosity, a Boston woman with fancy education coming west to teach farm children. They were polite enough, but distant, suspicious even. Elena wasn't like that. She asked about my life, actually listened to the answers, invited me to visit." She paused, looking down at her hands. "I only knew her for a few weeks before the baby came. But in that short time, she showed me more genuine kindness than most people I'd known for years. So when I heard her husband was struggling, that her baby was in trouble, she shrugged, but the gesture was anything but casual. It seemed like the least I could do. Pay forward the kindness she showed me. Caleb felt his throat tighten. She had a gift for that. Seeing people, really seeing them, making them feel like they mattered. She did. Nora's voice was soft. And for what it's worth, I think she'd be proud of you, fighting through that storm yesterday to get help for Grace. A lot of men would have given up. I almost did, Caleb admitted, the words coming out before he could stop them. Last night, before you knocked, I was sitting right here, holding Grace, and I thought maybe we were both done for, that I'd lost Elena, and now I was going to lose her daughter too, and maybe that was just how things were meant to be. But you didn't give up. No, I prayed. First time in years, probably. Just asked for help, for anything. He looked at her directly. And then you knocked. Nora held his gaze for a long moment, something unreadable in her dark eyes. I don't know about divine intervention, Mr. Monroe, but I do know that sometimes, when we're at our lowest, help arrives from unexpected places. That's not God. That's just people taking care of each other, the way we're meant to. Before Caleb could respond, Grace stirred in her cradle, making small waking sounds. Nora was on her feet immediately, crossing to the baby with that same natural grace he'd noticed the night before. "Good morning, little one," she murmured, lifting Grace into her arms. "Did you have sweet dreams? I bet you did, with that full belly." Grace blinked up at her, those blue eyes, Caleb's eyes, as Nora had noted, still hazy with sleep. Then, as Nora cradled her close, the baby's face scrunched up and she began to cry. "Oh, I know that sound," Nora said, not seeming at all bothered. "Someone needs changing. Mr. Monroe, where do you keep the clean cloths?" "In the chest, by the bed." Caleb started to stand. "I can finish your breakfast. I've got this." And she did. Caleb watched in something like awe as Nora efficiently changed Grace's diaper, talking to the baby the whole time in that soothing voice, making it seem easy when Caleb knew from experience it was anything but. Within minutes, Grace was clean, wrapped in fresh cloth, and being walked around the cabin as Nora warmed another bottle of milk. "You really do have experience with this," Caleb observed. 6 younger siblings, remember? I practically raised the last 3. Nora tested the milk temperature, then settled into the chair to feed Grace. "My mother wasn't well after the youngest was born, some kind of melancholy that the doctors couldn't fix. So I took over most of the household duties. I was 14 when James came along, 17 when Mary was born. By the time I was 20, I could run a house, manage children, and still find time to study." "Is that why you became a teacher? All that practice with children?" Nora's expression shifted, something complicated crossing her face. "Partly. But mostly I became a teacher because it was one of the few respectable professions available to an unmarried woman. And teaching in the West paid better than teaching in Boston." "You came west for the money?" "I came west for a fresh start." The words were simple, but the weight behind them suggested volumes left unsaid. Sometimes you need to leave everything behind and begin again. Caleb understood that impulse, though his own fresh start had been with Elena, not away from anything. He'd come west because the opportunities were here, because a man could build something from nothing if he worked hard enough. But there was something in Nora's tone that suggested her reasons were different, not running toward something, but away from it. Before he could probe further, Grace finished her bottle and let out a satisfied burp. Nora laughed, the sound bright and genuine, and Caleb felt something inside him lighten at the sound. "Well done, little lady," Nora said, kissing Grace's forehead. "Now you've got a full belly and clean clothes. Life is good, isn't it?" Grace made a gurgling sound that might have been agreement, and Nora stood, walking her around the room. The baby's eyes were alert now, tracking movement, taking in the world with that intense focus infants have. "She's going to be beautiful," Nora said. "She already is, really. Look at those eyes." "Elena's nose, though," Caleb said, echoing Nora's observation from the night before. "And her chin. Sometimes I look at her and I can see Elena so clearly it hurts." Nora turned to face him, Grace still cradled in her arms. "That must be hard, but also a gift in a way. Elena lives on in her daughter. I suppose. Caleb stood, collecting their empty bowls. I should get the sleigh ready. Take me a bit to dig out the barn doors and hitch Thunder. I'll watch Grace, Nora said immediately. Caleb hesitated. It was one thing to accept help in the middle of a crisis, quite another to keep imposing on someone who'd already done so much. But Nora seemed to read his thoughts. Mr. Monroe, it's easier for one person to dig out a barn than for one person to manage a baby while trying to make herself useful in an unfamiliar kitchen. Let me help. Please. The please did it. Caleb nodded. Thank you. Again. I'm starting to lose count of how many times I've said that. Then stop counting. Nora smiled. Just accept that sometimes people help each other, and that's okay. Caleb bundled up in his heavy coat, wrapping a scarf around his face, and headed out into the morning. The cold hit him like a physical force, stealing his breath. But after the claustrophobia of the cabin, it was almost refreshing. The world had been transformed overnight. Every fence post wore a foot-high cap of snow, drifts had buried the lower rail completely, and the path to the barn was invisible under a smooth white blanket. He grabbed a shovel from where it leaned against the cabin wall and began the hard work of digging. The snow was heavy, waterlogged, and his muscles protested the effort after weeks of poor eating and little sleep. But there was a strange satisfaction in the physical labor, in having a clear task with a clear solution. Dig here, clear this path, reach the barn, prepare the sleigh. Simple. Concrete. Unlike grief, which had no clear path and no obvious solution. Thunder nickered when Caleb finally forced open the barn door, and the horse's obvious pleasure at seeing him brought an unexpected lump to Caleb's throat. The two milk cows watched placidly from their stalls, undisturbed by the storm, and Caleb realized with a flash of guilt that he couldn't remember the last time he'd properly milked them. Yesterday morning, the day before? Time had become so strange. Sorry, boy, he murmured to Thunder, stroking the horse's nose. I've been a poor caretaker lately, but we're going to do better. All of us are going to do better. Thunder bumped his head against Caleb's chest, and Caleb spent a moment just standing there, forehead pressed against the horse's warm neck, drawing strength from the animal's solid presence. Then he got to work, mucking stalls, laying fresh straw, ensuring the animals had food and water. Basic things, but things he'd been letting slide. Things that Elena would have never let him neglect. The sleigh was in the back corner, covered with a tarp, and buried under miscellaneous equipment. Caleb dug it out, checking the runners and the frame. It was sturdy enough, built by a local carpenter 5 years ago, designed to handle Wyoming winters. He'd bought it thinking about future children, about family outings to town, about a life that had seemed secure and permanent. Now it would serve the simpler purpose of getting Nora Bennett safely back to the Hendersons. Hitching Thunder to the sleigh took longer than usual. His fingers were clumsy with cold, and the leather straps were stiff. But eventually everything was secured, and Caleb led horse and sleigh out into the white morning. The runners cut through the fresh snow smoothly, and Thunder seemed eager for the exercise after being cooped up. When Caleb returned to the cabin, he found an unexpected scene. Nora sat in the rocking chair with Grace on a blanket spread across her lap, and she was singing, not humming as she had the night before, but actually singing in a clear, sweet voice. Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird. And if that mockingbird don't sing, Mama's gonna buy you a diamond ring. She broke off when the door opened, looking almost embarrassed. I hope you don't mind. She seemed to like it. Mind? That was beautiful. Caleb stamped snow from his boots. Where'd you learn that? My mother used to sing it before she got sick. Nora lifted Grace from her lap, holding her upright. The sleigh's ready? All set. But Miss Bennett, before we go... Caleb moved closer, suddenly awkward. I need to ask you something. A favor. And I have no right to ask it, but I'm going to anyway. Nora's expression grew cautious. What kind of favor? Would you consider coming back? Not today, obviously. You need to rest, and so does Mrs. Henderson, knowing you're safe. But tomorrow maybe, or the next day, just to check on Grace. To make sure I'm doing things right. The words came out in a rush. I know it's an imposition, and you've already done more than anyone could expect, but I don't trust myself not to mess this up again. Nora studied him for a long moment, Grace gurgling contentedly in her arms. Mr. Monroe, you're not going to mess it up. You love your daughter. That's the most important thing. Love isn't enough if I don't know what I'm doing. Grace almost starved because I let the milk spoil. What if I make another mistake? What if next time there's no knock on the door? Then you learn from the mistakes. That's what all parents do. They stumble through and figure it out as they go. But I don't have Elena to figure it out with me. The admission cost him something, saying it aloud. I'm alone in this, and I'm terrified I'm going to fail her. Nora's expression softened. She looked down at Grace, then back at Caleb. I'll come back. Tomorrow, if the weather holds. I can show you some things. How to test if milk has gone bad, how to burp her properly, whatever you need. And if you want, I can help you set up a better system, organize things so it's easier to manage on your own. Relief flooded through Caleb so intensely he had to look away. Thank you. I'll pay you, of course, for your time, and you will not. Nora's voice was firm. This isn't a transaction, Mr. Monroe. This is neighbors helping neighbors. That's how survival works out here. Then at least let me give you something. Food for the Hendersons, to repay them for the supplies you brought. That I'll accept if you have it to spare, but no money. Agreed? Caleb nodded, not trusting his voice. He helped Nora bundle up in her coat and scarf, then carefully took Grace from her arms. The baby fussed slightly at the transfer, and Nora paused to stroke her cheek. Be good for your papa, she murmured. I'll see you tomorrow. Outside, the world was crystalline and bright, the sun breaking through the clouds to turn the snow into a field of diamonds. Caleb settled Nora into the sleigh, then wrapped Grace in multiple blankets and held her close as he climbed up beside Nora. Thunder set off without needing to be urged, the sleigh gliding smoothly over the packed snow. The journey to the Henderson place took nearly an hour, following fence lines and familiar landmarks that were barely visible under their white covering. They didn't talk much. The wind made conversation difficult, and besides, there was something peaceful about the silence. Grace slept through most of it, warm in her cocoon of blankets, and Caleb found himself intensely aware of Nora's presence beside him, solid and real. When they finally reached the Henderson farm, Mrs. Henderson came rushing out of the house despite the cold, her face a mixture of relief and worry. Nora Bennett, I've been beside myself. When the storm got so bad, I thought surely you'd turned back, but then you didn't come home, and I thought... She broke off, pressing a hand to her chest. Never mind what I thought. You're here, you're safe, and that's what matters. I'm sorry I worried you. Nora climbed down from the sleigh, then turned back to help Caleb with Grace. The storm was worse than expected. Mr. Monroe insisted I stay the night rather than risk the journey back. Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly, and Caleb saw the exact moment she began calculating the implications. A young unmarried woman spending the night alone with a widower. Even with a baby as chaperone, people would talk. It was the only sensible choice, Caleb said firmly. Miss Bennett saved my daughter's life last night. If anyone has a problem with the proprieties, they can take it up with me. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened. No one's going to have a problem, Mr. Monroe. Not if I have anything to say about it. How's the little one doing? Better, thanks to Miss Bennett. She's been feeding well, sleeping peacefully. Good, that's good. Mrs. Henderson reached out to touch Grace's bundled form gently. Elena would be glad to know she's thriving. The name hung in the cold air between them, and Caleb felt the familiar ache in his chest. Yes, she would. Nora had already gathered her things from the sleigh, the empty basket, her bag, and was heading toward the house. She paused at the door, turning back. Tomorrow then? Late morning? If the roads are clear? I'll be there, Caleb promised. He watched her disappear inside, saw her through the window being fussed over by Mrs. Henderson, and felt an odd reluctance to leave. But Grace was starting to stir, and the journey home would take another hour, so he clicked to thunder and turned the sleigh around. The ride back seemed longer, lonelier. Caleb talked to Grace, keeping up a steady stream of nonsense words and observations about the landscape, anything to fill the silence. The baby watched him with those serious blue eyes, and he wondered what she understood, what she remembered. Would she have any memory of her mother, or would Elena exist only in stories and photographs? Back at the cabin, Caleb brought Grace inside and stood in the doorway, looking at the cleaned floors, the organized kitchen, the signs of Nora's presence everywhere. The place felt different now, still empty of Elena, still shadowed by grief, but somehow less hopeless, as if a door had been opened, letting in fresh air. He spent the afternoon tending to tasks he'd neglected, properly milking the cows, chopping wood for the fire, organizing the supplies Nora had brought. When Grace woke hungry, he managed to warm the milk without incident, testing it on his wrist the way Nora had shown him. She took the bottle eagerly, and Caleb felt a small surge of pride. He could do this. With help, with practice, he could be the father Grace needed. That evening, as the sun set and painted the snow in shades of pink and gold, Caleb sat in his chair with Grace on his lap. He told her about her mother, about how Elena had laughed, how she'd sung while she worked, how she'd been so excited about becoming a mother. Grace listened or didn't listen, gurgling occasionally, grabbing at his fingers with her tiny hands. "We're going to be okay," Caleb told his daughter. "I don't know how yet, but we are. Miss Bennett's going to come back tomorrow and teach me how to take better care of you. And we're going to learn together, you and me. We're going to figure this out." Grace yawned, her whole face scrunching up with the effort, and Caleb laughed. A real laugh, the first in weeks. The sound startled him, almost guilty, but then he remembered something Nora had said. Elena would be proud of you. Maybe she would be. Maybe learning to laugh again, learning to live again for Grace's sake, wasn't a betrayal, but a tribute. As darkness fell and Grace drifted off to sleep, Caleb found himself thinking about the knock that had changed everything, about fate, or providence, or simple human kindness, about a woman brave enough to walk through a blizzard for a stranger's baby, and about how sometimes the worst moments of our lives contain the seeds of salvation. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or the day after that. But for the first time since Elena died, Caleb Monroe allowed himself to hope that there might be a future worth living, not just for Grace's sake, but for his own. The fire crackled, the baby slept, and outside the window stars began to emerge in the clearing sky, cold and distant, but undeniably beautiful. Caleb sat in the peaceful darkness, holding his daughter close, and waited for the morning to come. Nora returned the next morning just as she'd promised, arriving in the Henderson wagon with Mr. Henderson himself at the reins. Caleb had been watching for her since dawn, telling himself it was only to make sure she arrived safely, not admitting the nervous energy that had kept him pacing the cabin, straightening things that were already straight, rehearsing words he might say. "Morning, Monroe," Mr. Henderson called out as he helped Nora down from the wagon. He was a solid man in his 60s, weathered by years of frontier life but still strong. "Brought some fresh milk from the dairy. Wife thought you might need it." "I do. Thank you." Caleb came forward, Grace bundled in his arms. "And thank you for sending Miss Bennett the other night. I don't know what would have happened if—" "No need for thanks between neighbors." Mr. Henderson waved off the gratitude, though his eyes were kind. "Besides, this one here wouldn't have taken no for an answer. Stubborn as they come when she sets her mind to something." Nora's cheeks colored slightly. "I'm standing right here, Mr. Henderson." "I know it. That's why I said it where you could hear." The old man chuckled, then climbed back onto the wagon. "I'll be back in a few hours to fetch her, Monroe. Got some business in town, but I'll swing by on my way home." "I can bring her back myself," Caleb offered. "Nonsense. You've got enough to manage without making that trip twice in 2 days. Besides, gives me an excuse to check on you, make sure you're managing all right." Mr. Henderson tipped his hat. "Miss Bennett, you behave yourself. And Monroe, you listen to what she tells you. This girl raised half her siblings. She knows what she's about." With that, he clicked to the horses and drove off, leaving Caleb and Nora standing in the snow-bright morning, suddenly awkward with each other now that they were alone again. "He's a good man," Caleb said finally. "He is. They both are." Nora shifted the basket she carried to her other arm. "Mrs. Henderson sent fresh bread and some stew. She said you're probably living on jerky and hardtack, and that's no good for a man who needs his strength." "She's not wrong." Caleb stepped back, gesturing toward the cabin. "Come in. It's too cold to stand out here talking." Inside, the cabin was warm. Caleb had made sure of that, stoking the fire high, wanting everything to be right. Nora unwrapped her coat and scarf, hanging them by the door with the same natural ease she'd shown before, as if she'd done it 100 times rather than just once. How was she last night? Nora moved immediately to Grace, reaching out to stroke the baby's cheek. Did she sleep well? Better than I expected, woke twice for feeding, but she settled right back down. Caleb felt absurdly proud reporting this, as if he'd accomplished something remarkable. I tested the milk the way you showed me, on my wrist. Made sure it wasn't too hot. Good. That's good. Nora smiled, and Caleb felt warmed by her approval in a way that seemed disproportionate to the simple praise. And you? Did you sleep? Some. Enough. It was mostly true. He'd dozed between Grace's feedings, though his sleep had been restless, punctuated by dreams he couldn't quite remember upon waking. I've been awake since about 5, though. Couldn't settle. Nervous about today? There was no judgment in the question, only gentle understanding. Maybe. I don't know. I just... Caleb trailed off, unsure how to explain the strange mixture of anticipation and anxiety that had kept him moving through the dark hours before dawn. I want to do this right. For Grace. I need to learn how to take care of her properly so I don't keep depending on other people's charity. It's not charity, Nora said, a slight edge creeping into her voice. And there's no shame in learning, Mr. Monroe. Everyone needs help sometimes. That's not weakness, that's being human. Maybe. He wasn't entirely convinced, but he didn't want to argue. Where should we start? They spent the morning in a kind of domestic education that felt both intimate and practical. Nora showed him how to properly prepare formula, explaining the ratios of milk to water, how to test temperature not just on the wrist but also by shaking a drop onto the back of the hand. She demonstrated the correct way to hold Grace during feeding, supporting her head and keeping her at an angle to prevent air bubbles. See how she's gulping? That means she's getting air along with the milk. Nora adjusted Grace's position slightly. If you keep her more upright, like this, she can control the flow better. Less gas, less fussiness later. Caleb watched intently, memorizing every movement, every detail. When it was his turn to try, Nora stood close, her hand hovering near his elbow, ready to correct but not interfering unless necessary. That's it, she encouraged as Grace fed smoothly. You're doing well. She trusts you, can you feel it? The way she's relaxed in your arms? He could feel it, and the sensation filled him with a fierce, protective love that was almost painful in its intensity. This tiny person, so vulnerable, so completely dependent on him, she was all he had left of Elena, but she was also herself, her own small soul. He would not fail her. He couldn't. They moved on to other lessons. How to recognize different types of cries, the subtle differences between hunger and tiredness, and the need for a diaper change. Nora taught him to check Grace's temperature by touch, to count her breaths to ensure they were steady, to examine her skin for signs of dehydration or illness. You're going to be alone out here, Nora said as they worked, so you need to be able to recognize problems early. If her breathing becomes labored, if she develops a fever, if she won't eat for more than a few hours. Those are times to get help immediately, weather be damned. How do I know what's normal and what's dangerous? Trust your instincts. I know that sounds vague, but you'll learn to read her. Every baby's different, but you'll learn Grace's patterns, her rhythms. When something's wrong, you'll know it in your gut. As the morning progressed into afternoon, their conversation drifted beyond the purely practical. Caleb found himself asking questions he hadn't realized he needed answered, about development milestones, about when babies started smiling intentionally, about what Elena might have wanted for their daughter. She talked about you, Nora said quietly as she folded clean diapers at the table. That day at the harvest social, she said you'd been nervous about becoming a father, worried you wouldn't know what to do. I was terrified, Caleb admitted. Still am. She said you'd be a wonderful father because you cared so much about getting it right, that the men who should worry are the ones who think they already know everything. Nora glanced up, meeting his eyes. She was right, you know. You're going to be fine. You already love Grace more than anything. The rest is just learning and practice. Something tight in Caleb's chest loosened slightly. I wish she was here to see it, to see Grace growing. I know, but she is seeing it in a way. Through Grace, through you, through the life you're building for your daughter. Nora's voice was gentle but certain. That's not religion talking. I'm not sure what I believe about heaven or spirits or any of that, but I know that love doesn't just disappear when someone dies. It transforms, becomes part of the world in different ways. They were interrupted by a knock, Mr. Henderson returning earlier than expected. He stood in the doorway, stamping snow from his boots, his expression unusually serious. Sorry to rush, but we need to head back. There's weather coming in again, front moving faster than expected. I want to get home before it hits. Caleb looked out the window and saw that the bright morning had given way to gray clouds rolling in from the west, heavy and threatening. The temperature had dropped noticeably, even in the past hour. Of course. Nora immediately began gathering her things, but she paused, looking at Caleb with concern. Will you be all right? If another storm comes, I'll be fine. We'll be fine. He gestured to the well-stocked cupboards, the organized supplies. Thanks to you, we have everything we need. But if you need anything, or if Grace, then I'll figure it out, or I'll wait for the weather to clear and come find you. Caleb managed a smile. I can't keep depending on rescue missions every time things get difficult. It's not about dependence, Nora said quietly, pulling on her coat. It's about community, about people looking out for each other. I know, and I'm grateful. But you've done more than enough, Miss Bennett. You've given me the tools I need. Now I have to prove I can use them. Something flickered in Nora's eyes. Hurt, maybe, or disappointment, but she covered it quickly with a nod. Of course. You're right, I should. She trailed off, then turned to Grace, who was dozing in her cradle. Goodbye, little one. You be good for your papa. At the door, she paused one more time. Mr. Monroe, if you do need help, promise me you won't let pride stand in the way of asking for it. Not for your sake, for Grace's. I promise. He stood in the doorway, holding Grace, watching the Henderson wagon disappear into the gray afternoon. The wind was picking up already, carrying the smell of snow, and Caleb felt a sudden, sharp loneliness that took him by surprise. The cabin, which had felt warm and alive just minutes ago with Nora's presence, now seemed empty and quiet. Just you and me again, baby girl, he murmured to Grace. We can do this. We can. The storm hit that evening, though it wasn't as fierce as the blizzard from 2 nights before. Snow fell steadily, accumulating in drifts against the windows, and the wind howled but without the same violent fury. Caleb went through the evening routine with careful attention, warming Grace's bottle, feeding her while she was alert and hungry, burping her properly, changing her before putting her down in the cradle. Everything Nora had taught him, executed step by step. Grace went to sleep easily, and Caleb found himself at loose ends. He'd grown accustomed to the constant demand of her care, and now, with her sleeping peacefully and nothing urgent requiring his attention, he didn't know what to do with himself. He tried to read. There was a book of poetry Elena had loved, but the words wouldn't focus. He considered working on the broken fence rail he'd been meaning to repair, but it was dark and the barn seemed impossibly far away. Finally, he sat in his chair and just thought, letting his mind wander where it would. He thought about Elena, about their courtship and marriage, about the dreams they'd shared for their future. He thought about Grace, about the woman she might become. And he thought, more than he wanted to admit, about Nora Bennett. She'd been in his home for less than 48 hours total, but her impact felt disproportionate to the time. It wasn't just the practical help, though that had been invaluable. It was something else. The way she moved through space with quiet confidence, the way she spoke to Grace with such natural tenderness, the way she'd looked at him with understanding rather than pity when he'd confessed his fears. Caleb shook his head, feeling guilty. Elena had been dead less than 3 weeks. He had no business thinking about another woman, feeling anything that resembled attraction or interest. It was grief, he told himself. Loneliness. The natural human response to kindness after weeks of isolation. Nothing more. But that night, when he finally fell asleep, he dreamed not of Elena but of dark eyes and a gentle voice singing lullabies, and he woke in the gray dawn feeling disoriented and ashamed. The days that followed fell into a pattern. The storm cleared after 2 days, and Caleb ventured to the Henderson place with Grace bundled against his chest. He told himself he was going to thank Mrs. Henderson properly, to return the dishes, to be neighborly. He didn't admit, even to himself, that he was hoping to see Nora. She was there, helping Mrs. Henderson with the washing, and her face lit up when she saw Grace. "Look how alert she is. Has she been eating well?" "Every 3 hours, like clockwork," Caleb reported, feeling that same disproportionate pride. "Sometimes she goes 4 hours at night, which gives me a good stretch of sleep." "That's wonderful. She's growing. Can you see it?" Her cheeks are fuller. Nora reached out to touch Grace's hand, and the baby grabbed her finger with surprising strength. "Oh, you're getting strong, aren't you?" Mrs. Henderson, watching this exchange with shrewd eyes, invited Caleb to stay for lunch. He accepted, telling himself it was only polite, and found himself at their table sharing a meal and conversation. Mr. Henderson asked about the fence repairs, about whether Caleb would be able to manage the spring planting alone, about practical matters that grounded the discussion in the everyday realities of frontier life. But Caleb was intensely aware of Nora across the table, the way she smiled at something Mr. Henderson said, the way she helped Mrs. Henderson serve the food, the way she kept glancing at Grace with that tender expression. "School starts up again next week," Mrs. Henderson mentioned. "Nora will be back to teaching, which means she won't have as much free time for visiting." "Of course," Caleb said quickly. "I wouldn't expect. She's already done so much." "I could still visit on weekends," Nora offered. "If you wanted, just to check on Grace, make sure everything's going smoothly." "That's not necessary. We're managing fine." "I know you are, but I'd like to. If you don't mind." Their eyes met across the table, and something unspoken passed between them. Mrs. Henderson made a small, satisfied sound and changed the subject to town gossip, but Caleb barely heard it. He was thinking about weekends, about Nora's visits becoming a regular occurrence, about what that might mean. After lunch, Nora walked him out to where Thunder was hitched. The day was cold but clear, the sun brilliant on the snow. "She really is doing well," Nora said, looking at Grace nestled in Caleb's arms. "You should be proud. I couldn't have done it without you." "Yes, you could have. You'd have figured it out. I just helped you figure it out faster." She paused, seeming to struggle with something. "Mr. Monroe, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you really come today? Was it just to return the dishes, or—" She trailed off, leaving the question hanging. Caleb felt his face heat despite the cold. "I wanted to see you, to thank you properly, to make sure you were all right after that journey in the storm." "I'm fine. Sturdy New England stock, remember?" But she was smiling, a small, pleased smile that made something in Caleb's chest tighten. "Good. That's good." He cleared his throat, suddenly awkward. "I should get back. It's a long ride, and Grace will need feeding soon." "Of course." Nora stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself. "I'll see you next weekend then? Sunday afternoon, if that works?" Sunday would be perfect. He rode home with Grace sleeping against his chest and his thoughts in turmoil. This was wrong, wasn't it? Elena hadn't been gone a month, and here he was looking forward to another woman's visits, thinking about her smile, anticipating her presence in his home. What kind of husband did that make him? What kind of man? But another voice in his head, one that sounded suspiciously like Nora herself, asked different questions. What kind of father would he be if he isolated himself and Grace completely? What kind of life could he provide for his daughter if he closed himself off from all human connection out of some misguided sense of loyalty to the dead? The internal argument continued through the week. Caleb threw himself into work, repairing fences, tending the animals, chopping enough wood to last through the rest of winter. When he wasn't working, he focused entirely on Grace, talking to her constantly, singing the songs Nora had taught him, watching for every small change in her development. She was changing too, growing more alert, her eyes tracking movement more smoothly, her grip getting stronger. Once, when he was changing her diaper, she looked up at him and smiled, a real smile, not just gas, and Caleb felt his heart nearly burst with love. "Your mama would have loved to see that," he whispered. "She would have been so proud of you." But even as he said it, he felt a pang of guilt. Because in that moment, his first impulse had been to share the news with Nora, to see her face light up with joy at Grace's milestone. Elena should have been the one he wanted to tell. Elena should have been here to witness it. Sunday arrived cold and bright, and Caleb found himself nervously preparing the cabin for Nora's visit. He cleaned more thoroughly than necessary, made sure the fire was burning just right, even attempted to bake bread using Elena's recipe. The result was edible if not impressive, dense and slightly burned on one end, but at least it was something to offer. Nora arrived in the late afternoon, walking this time rather than riding. "It's not far," she explained when Caleb expressed concern, "and the exercise is good for me. I've been cooped up in the schoolhouse all week." "How are your students?" "Challenging, as always, but wonderful. I have 17 this year, ranging from 6 to 14. The older boys sometimes test my patience, but they're good kids at heart." She removed her coat and immediately moved to Grace's cradle. "Oh, she's awake. Hello, sweetheart. Did you miss me?" Grace kicked her legs and waved her arms, and Nora laughed with delight. "I think that's a yes. May I hold her?" "Of course." Caleb watched as Nora lifted Grace, settling her in the crook of her arm with practiced ease. The baby gazed up at her, and Nora made silly faces, eliciting what might have been a giggle or might have been just a hiccup. Either way, the sight filled Caleb with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "I have news," Caleb said. She smiled. A real smile, not just reflex. "It was 3 days ago, and I've been waiting to tell you." Nora's face lit up. "Did she? Oh, that's wonderful. They start smiling around 6 weeks, and she's right on schedule. Did you smile back at her? They need to see faces smiling to learn how to do it properly." I smiled. I think I might have cried a little too. "That's allowed." Nora looked at him, and there was understanding in her eyes. "It's bittersweet, isn't it? These milestones, happy because she's healthy and developing, but sad because Elena's not here to see them." Caleb finished the thought. "Yes, exactly that." They were quiet for a moment, the only sound Grace's contented babbling and the crackle of the fire. Then Nora spoke again, her voice soft. "Can I tell you something? Something I haven't told anyone else here?" "Of course. I was engaged once, back in Boston, to a man named Richard Calloway. He was from a good family, had prospects, was everything my parents wanted for me." She paused, still looking down at Grace rather than at Caleb. "But he wasn't everything I wanted. He was controlling, dismissive of my opinions, expected me to give up teaching once we married. Still, I might have gone through with it, that's what was expected, except that I discovered he was seeing someone else. Another woman, someone he'd been involved with before our engagement." Caleb felt a surge of anger on her behalf. "I'm sorry, that must have been humiliating, devastating. It was both. But here's the thing. Breaking off the engagement was harder than discovering the betrayal, because suddenly I was damaged goods, a woman who'd turned down a perfectly acceptable match. People whispered. Opportunities dried up. Even my own family seemed disappointed in me, as if I'd failed them somehow." She finally looked up, meeting his eyes. "So I left, came west where no one knew me, where I could start fresh without the weight of all that history. That took courage. Or cowardice. I've never been sure which." Nora smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "The point is, I understand about guilt, about feeling like you should feel a certain way, or not feel a certain way, because of what happened in the past. But Mr. Monroe, Caleb, life doesn't stop just because we're not ready for it to continue. Grace is going to keep growing, keep changing, keep needing you. And you're allowed to feel joy in that, even while you're grieving Elena. You're allowed to laugh, to hope, to connect with other people. It's not betrayal. It's survival." Caleb swallowed hard, feeling exposed by how precisely she'd identified the war happening inside him. "I don't know how to do both, how to grieve and live at the same time. No one does at first, but you learn. You put one foot in front of the other, and eventually the steps get easier." She looked back down at Grace. "And you let people help you, not because you're weak, but because that's what people are meant to do." Before Caleb could respond, Grace began to fuss, her face scrunching up in a way they both recognized. "Someone's hungry," Nora observed. "Want me to prepare the bottle?" "No, I'll do it. You've been on your feet all week. Sit, rest." He moved to the stove, falling into the routine Nora had taught him, testing the milk, warming the bottle, shaking a drop onto his wrist. When he turned back, Nora was settled in the rocking chair with Grace, swaying gently, singing that same lullaby she'd sung before. Caleb handed her the bottle, and she fed Grace while he sat across from her watching. It should have felt domestic, ordinary, but there was something almost sacred about the moment. This woman caring for his daughter while firelight played across both their faces, the winter darkness pressing against the windows, the rest of the world falling away until there was only this room, this moment, this fragile peace. "Thank you," Caleb said quietly. "Not just for today, for all of it, for coming through the storm, for teaching me how to be a better father, for—" He gestured vaguely, unable to articulate the fullness of what he felt. "You don't need to thank me." "I do, though. Because you didn't have to do any of this. You could have stayed safe at the Hendersons, could have let someone else check on us, could have taught me the basics and moved on with your life. But you keep coming back." Nora was quiet for a long moment, her attention seemingly focused on Grace. But when she spoke, her voice was steady. "I keep coming back because I want to. Because being here with you and Grace feels right in a way nothing else has felt since I came west. I can't explain it better than that." Their eyes met, and the air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken things. Questions neither dared ask, feelings neither was ready to name. Grace finished her bottle, oblivious to the adult complexities happening around her, and burped contentedly when Nora patted her back. The moment passed, or perhaps they both deliberately let it pass. Nora stood, laying Grace in her cradle, and then noticed the bread on the table. "Did you make this?" "Attempted to make it," Caleb corrected. "It's not very good." Nora broke off a piece, tasted it, and smiled. "It's better than my first attempt at bread. I burned it so badly we had to throw out the pan. This is actually edible, which means you're doing fine." They shared the bread with butter and jam, talking about easier things: the school, the town, the neighbors, the coming spring. Nora told stories about her students that made Caleb laugh, and he found himself telling her about his early days in Wyoming, when everything had been new and Elena had been alive and the future had seemed boundless with possibility. By the time Nora prepared to leave, the sun had set and the temperature had dropped sharply. Caleb insisted on hitching Thunder to walk her back to the Henderson place, arguing that he couldn't let her walk alone in the dark, and she accepted without the protest she might have made weeks ago. The journey was quiet, both of them wrapped in their own thoughts. At the Henderson gate, Nora dismounted and handed him Thunder's reins. "Same time next week?" she asked. "If you want." "I do." She hesitated, then added, "Caleb, what I said before about life continuing, I meant it. Don't lock yourself away in grief. Don't deny yourself the possibility of happiness, whatever form that might take." Before he could respond, she turned and walked quickly toward the house, leaving him standing in the cold darkness, Thunder's breath steaming in the night air, his heart pounding with something that felt dangerously like hope. The weeks that followed transformed the rhythm of Caleb's life in ways he couldn't have predicted. Nora's Sunday visits became the axis around which his days turned, each week building toward that afternoon when she would arrive at his door with her quiet smile and gentle competence. He told himself it was for Grace's sake, that his daughter needed the female influence, that the practical advice Nora offered was invaluable. But in the honest moments before sleep, Caleb knew the truth was more complicated. Winter began its slow retreat as February gave way to March. The snow still fell, but with less frequency and fury. The days grew incrementally longer, and occasionally Caleb could catch the scent of earth beneath the frozen crust, a promise of spring hidden under winter's stubborn grip. Grace was changing too, growing stronger and more aware each day. She could hold her head up now when Caleb placed her on her stomach, could track his movements across the room with those serious blue eyes, could grab onto his fingers with surprising determination. "She's going to be strong-willed," Nora observed one Sunday afternoon as Grace stubbornly refused to let go of a wooden rattle Caleb had carved. "Look at that grip. She knows what she wants, and she's not letting go." "Gets that from her mother," Caleb said automatically, then felt the familiar pang. Elena had been strong-willed, had crossed half a continent to marry him despite her family's objections, had faced the hardships of frontier life with determination and grace. Elena never backed down from anything. Nora looked at him thoughtfully. "You talk about her more easily now. In the beginning, you could barely say her name." "Does that bother you, that I talk about my wife?" "Of course not. She was your wife, Grace's mother. She should be talked about, remembered. Nora settled into the rocking chair with Grace in her arms. The people we love don't disappear just because they're gone. They live on in our stories, our memories, the way they shaped us. It was a generous sentiment, especially given what Caleb had begun to suspect about his own feelings. Because somewhere between that first desperate night when Nora had knocked on his door and this quiet Sunday afternoon, something had shifted. He looked forward to her visits with an anticipation that had nothing to do with needing help with Grace. He found himself thinking about things she'd said, conversations they'd had, the sound of her laugh. He caught himself wondering what she thought about, what she dreamed of, what had really driven her west beyond the broken engagement she'd mentioned. He felt guilty about these thoughts, disloyal to Elena's memory. But as Nora had said, life didn't stop just because he wasn't ready for it to continue. "Can I ask you something?" Caleb said suddenly, the words emerging before he'd fully formed the question. "That man in Boston, the one who hurt you, do you still think about him?" Nora's hand stilled on Grace, her expression growing distant. "Sometimes. Not with longing or regret, but more like examining an old scar. Wondering how I could have been so blind, how I mistook control for care." She paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. "But mostly I think about the woman I was then. So eager to please, so willing to make myself smaller to fit into someone else's vision of what I should be. Coming west changed that. Out here, I could be myself without apology." "And who is that?" "Yourself, I mean." She smiled, but there was something melancholy in it. "I'm still figuring that out, but I know I'm someone who wants to matter, to make a difference. Teaching helps with that, shaping young minds, giving children opportunities they might not otherwise have. But sometimes I wonder if it's enough, or if I'm meant for something more. More than teaching? More than being alone." The words came out soft, almost reluctant. I watched the families in town, the Hendersons with their comfortable partnership, even Mrs. Morrison at the general store with her husband and their 4 children. And I think about what I gave up, or what was taken from me. The chance at that kind of life. Caleb felt his heartbeat quicken. "You could still have that. You're young, accomplished, kind. Any man would be lucky to—" "Would they?" Nora looked at him directly, and something in her gaze made his breath catch. "I'm damaged goods, remember? A woman who broke an engagement, who ran away from her old life, who's too educated and too independent for most men's comfort. The eligible bachelors in Pine Hollow Valley aren't exactly lining up at the schoolhouse door. Then they're fools." The words hung between them, weighted with more meaning than Caleb had intended. Nora's cheeks colored slightly, and she looked down at Grace, who had fallen asleep in her arms. "That's kind of you to say," she murmured, "but kindness and reality are often different things." Before Caleb could respond, though what he would have said he didn't know, there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find Mr. Henderson standing there, his expression unusually serious. "Sorry to interrupt," the old man said, his eyes moving between Caleb and Nora with an assessing look that made Caleb suddenly aware of how domestic the scene must appear. "But Nora, we need to head back soon. Mrs. Henderson's rheumatism is acting up bad, and she's asking for you." "Of course." Nora stood immediately, gently transferring the sleeping Grace into Caleb's arms. "Tell her I'll be right there, Mr. Henderson nodded and stepped back outside, but not before giving Caleb a long, measuring look that was impossible to interpret. Nora gathered her things quickly, but at the door she paused, turning back to face Caleb. "Thank you for today, for the conversation, for—" She trailed off, then seemed to gather her courage. "For seeing me, really seeing me, not just as the school teacher or the helpful neighbor. That means more than you know." "Nora," Caleb started, but she was already heading out into the cold afternoon, leaving him standing in the doorway with Grace in his arms and a tumult of feelings he didn't know how to name. That night, after Grace was fed and sleeping, Caleb sat by the fire and let himself think the thoughts he'd been pushing away for weeks. He was falling for Nora Bennett. There was no other way to describe it. The way his heart lifted when he saw her, the way her absence felt like a physical ache, the way he imagined a future that included her presence in this cabin, in his life, in Grace's life. But Elena had been dead less than 2 months. The grief was still raw, still present in quiet moments and sudden memories. How could he be mourning his wife and falling for another woman simultaneously? What kind of man did that make him? The answer came not in words, but in a memory. Elena on their wedding night, holding his face in her hands, making him promise something. If anything happens to me, Caleb Monroe, you promise me you'll live. Not just survive, but really live. Find joy. Find love again. Don't lock yourself away in grief and waste the years you have left. He'd laughed at the time, told her nothing was going to happen, that they had decades ahead of them. But she'd insisted, making him swear, and he'd promised because it had seemed like an easy oath to keep when death was a distant, abstract thing. Now that promise felt like permission, or perhaps like an obligation. Elena would have wanted him to be happy. She would have wanted Grace to grow up in a house filled with warmth and laughter, not shadowed by perpetual mourning. She would have approved of Nora, of her kindness, her strength, her devotion to Grace. But knowing what Elena would have wanted and allowing himself to act on his feelings were two different things. The gap between them felt vast, unbridgeable. The next Sunday, when Nora arrived, she seemed different, more reserved, more formal. She greeted Grace with her usual warmth, but with Caleb she was distant, almost cold. She checked on Grace's development, offered advice about introducing strained vegetables to supplement the milk, and prepared to leave after less than an hour. "You don't have to go so soon," Caleb said, hearing the pleading note in his voice and not caring. "Stay for supper at least. I made stew. Your recipe, the one you taught me. I can't. I have lessons to prepare for tomorrow, and Mrs. Henderson needs help with—" "Nora, what's wrong? Did I do something? Say something?" She stopped, her hand on the door latch, her back to him. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Mr. Henderson talked to me on the ride home last week. He said people in town are starting to gossip about my visits here, about how it looks. An unmarried woman spending time alone with a widower. He said I should be more careful about my reputation." Caleb felt anger surge through him, hot and sudden. "That's ridiculous. You're helping with Grace. Anyone with sense can see there's nothing improper." "Can they?" Nora turned to face him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Because I'm not sure I can anymore. Tell where neighborly help ends and something else begins." The admission hung in the air between them, dangerous and thrilling. Caleb took a step toward her, then stopped, unsure. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I look forward to Sundays more than I should, that I think about you and Grace during the week, wondering how you're managing, hoping you're well, that when I'm here, in this cabin, I feel more at home than I've felt anywhere since leaving Boston." She wiped at her eyes impatiently. "And I'm saying that it's wrong. You're grieving. You're vulnerable. I'm taking advantage of—" "You're not taking advantage of anything." Caleb closed the distance between them in 2 strides. "Nora, do you think I haven't noticed? Do you think I don't feel it too?" "Don't." She held up a hand, stopping him. "Don't say something you'll regret. Elena hasn't been gone 3 months. You're confused, grateful for the help, but it's not confusion." The words came out fierce, certain. "And yes, I'm grateful, but that's not why I wait for Sundays like a man in the desert waiting for rain. That's not why I find myself wondering what you think about things, what makes you laugh, what you dream about when you're alone. That's not why I carved that rattle for Grace using techniques you mentioned liking, hoping you'd notice and be pleased." Nora stared at him, her lips parted in surprise. "You carved that for me? I thought I carved it for both of you, because somehow, in the past few weeks, you've become part of our lives in a way I never expected and can't imagine losing." Caleb ran a hand through his hair, frustrated by his inability to articulate what he felt. "I know it's too soon. I know people will talk. I know I should wait a respectable amount of time before I even think about whatever this is. But Nora, I can't keep pretending that my feelings for you are purely practical or neighborly, because they're not." They haven't been for a while now. The silence that followed was broken only by Grace's soft breathing from her cradle and the crackle of the fire. Nora stood frozen, her hand still on the door latch, her expression a mixture of fear and hope and longing. "What are you asking me?" she finally whispered. "I don't know," Caleb admitted. "I don't have the right to ask you for anything. I'm a widower with a 3-month-old baby, living in a cabin miles from anywhere, still grieving my wife. I have nothing to offer you except complications and small-town gossip and a life that's probably harder than anything you imagined when you came west." "That's not nothing," Nora said softly. "And you're not nothing. Neither is Grace." She took a shaky breath. "But Caleb, I need to know, are you confusing grief and loneliness with something else? Are you reaching for me because I'm here, because I'm convenient, or because you actually see me as more than just help for Grace?" The question was fair, and it deserved an honest answer. Caleb thought about the past weeks, about the moments that had mattered. Nora's laugh when Grace did something amusing, the way she argued with him about politics during one long afternoon, the quiet companionship of sitting together while Grace slept, the stories she'd shared about her students and her life. He thought about how he noticed small things, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was concentrating, the determined set of her jaw when she was teaching him something important, the softness in her expression when she looked at Grace. "I see you," he said quietly. Not as a replacement for Elena, no one could ever replace her, but as Nora Bennett, schoolteacher from Boston, stubborn enough to walk through a blizzard to help a stranger, brave enough to start over in a new place, kind enough to keep coming back even when you didn't have to. "I see you, Nora. And what I see is someone I want in my life, in Grace's life, in whatever way you're willing to be there." Tears spilled over Nora's cheeks, and she made no move to wipe them away. "This is crazy. We barely know each other. It's too soon. People will say—" "Let them say what they want." Caleb took another step closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. "I spent my whole life doing what was expected, following the rules, being proper. And none of it protected me from loss or pain, so maybe it's time to stop worrying about what people think and start living according to what I feel." "And what do you feel?" "That I'm falling in love with you." The words came out raw, unpolished. "Maybe I have been since that night you knocked on my door like an angel in a snowstorm. Maybe it happened gradually over these past weeks. I don't know exactly when, but I know it's true. And I know I don't want you to stop coming here. Don't want to lose what we've started building. Don't want to wake up a year from now and regret not telling you how I feel." Nora closed her eyes, fresh tears streaming down her face. When she opened them again, there was a resolve in her expression that hadn't been there before. "I'm falling in love with you too," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "With you and with Grace, with this life, with the possibility of belonging somewhere again. But Caleb, we have to be smart about this. If there's going to be something between us, we need to do it right. Courting, proper and public, so people can see there's nothing shameful or rushed about it. And we need to give ourselves time, real time, to be sure this isn't just circumstances pushing us together." "Courting," Caleb repeated, feeling a smile tug at his lips despite the seriousness of the moment. "I haven't courted anyone since I was 20 years old." "Then you're out of practice." Nora smiled too, watery but genuine. "Which means you'll need to work extra hard to impress me." The tension broke, and Caleb laughed. A real full laugh that felt like the first deep breath after being underwater. Nora laughed too, and suddenly they were both giddy with relief and possibility and the sheer strangeness of the situation. "So what happens now?" Caleb asked when they'd both sobered. "Now I go back to the Hendersons and tell Mrs. Henderson that yes, there is something developing between us, but that we're going to be proper about it. And you make sure you're in town next Saturday for the social at the church. That's where proper courting starts, in public, where everyone can see that we're not hiding anything." "Next Saturday," Caleb confirmed. "I'll be there." Nora reached out and squeezed his hand once, quickly, before pulling away. "And Caleb, thank you. For being honest. For not hiding behind propriety or fear. For seeing me." "Thank you for knocking on my door that night," he replied. "For saving us. For staying." She left then, and Caleb watched from the doorway until she was out of sight. Grace stirred in her cradle, and he went to her, lifting her into his arms. "What do you think, baby girl?" he murmured. "Your papa's going courting. Is that crazy? Am I moving too fast?" Grace made a gurgling sound and grabbed at his nose, which he chose to interpret as approval. The week that followed was strange, familiar in its routines but charged with new anticipation. Caleb found himself planning what he'd wear to the social, rehearsing things he might say, feeling like a nervous boy rather than a 32-year-old widower. He cleaned the cabin thoroughly, as if Nora might see it even though she wouldn't be there. He practiced carrying on conversations with Grace, testing out topics that might be suitable for public courting. "I could talk about the weather," he told Grace as he fed her one evening. "That's safe." Or ask about her teaching. Or he trailed off, realizing how absurd this was. He and Nora had spent hours in deep conversation about life and loss and hope and fear. They'd seen each other at their most vulnerable, and now he was supposed to make polite small talk in front of the entire community? But he understood why it was necessary. They needed to do this right, to give their relationship the legitimacy of proper courtship, to show the town that there was nothing sordid or rushed about their feelings for each other. Saturday arrived cold but clear. Caleb bathed, shaved, dressed in his best shirt and vest, clothes he hadn't worn since Elena's funeral, and he tried not to think about that. He bundled Grace carefully and drove the sleigh into town, arriving at the church just as the social was beginning. The church hall was warm and crowded, filled with families Caleb hadn't seen since before Elena died. People greeted him with varying degrees of warmth and curiosity, their eyes moving to Grace with that mixture of pity and sentiment that new babies always inspired. "Caleb Monroe, as I live and breathe," Mrs. Morrison from the general store exclaimed, swooping in to peek at Grace. "We've been wondering when you'd venture into town. And look at this precious girl. She's grown so much. Looks just like her mama." "Thank you, Mrs. Morrison." Caleb endured the attention patiently, scanning the room for Nora. He found her near the refreshment table, surrounded by several of her students and their parents. She wore a dark blue dress he hadn't seen before, her hair pulled back in a style that was both proper and becoming. When their eyes met across the room, she smiled, a small, private smile that was just for him, and Caleb felt his heart stutter. He made his way through the crowd, stopping to accept condolences and make small talk, until he finally reached her side. "Miss Bennett," he said formally, aware of the eyes on them. "It's good to see you. Mr. Monroe. And baby Grace." Nora's tone matched his in formality, but her eyes were warm. "I didn't know you'd be attending today. I thought it was time I rejoined the living." He paused, then added more quietly, "And I was hoping to see you." Around them, conversations had died down as people noticed this interaction. Caleb saw Mrs. Henderson watching with satisfaction, Mr. Henderson with his arms crossed and a skeptical expression, various townspeople with interest ranging from benign curiosity to sharp speculation. "Would you like to sit with me?" Caleb asked, gesturing to the rows of chairs being set up for the minister's welcome speech. "I find I could use the company, and Grace seems to enjoy your presence." It was as formal and proper an invitation as anyone could want, made in full view of the community. Nora's smile widened slightly. "I'd be delighted, Mr. Monroe." They sat together through the minister's speech about spring renewal and new beginnings, and Caleb couldn't help but feel there was a certain appropriateness to the timing. Afterward, as people mingled and ate the potluck offerings, Nora introduced him to several families he didn't know well, parents of her students, new arrivals to the valley, people who might become friends rather than just acquaintances. "Your daughter is lovely," one woman said, a Mrs. Patterson, whose 3 children attended Nora's school. "And I must say, Mr. Monroe, it's brave of you to bring her out so young. Many widowers would have given up the child to relatives." "Grace is all I have left of my wife," Caleb replied carefully. "I'd sooner give up my own life than give her up." "And he's doing remarkably well caring for her," Nora added, her voice warm with approval that felt genuine even if it was also strategic. "He's a devoted father." "Well, if you ever need help, Mr. Monroe, the women of this church would be happy to assist. We look after our own." Mrs. Patterson's eyes moved between Caleb and Nora with barely concealed interest. "Though I see you already have help from Miss Bennett." "Miss Bennett has been invaluable," Caleb confirmed. "I don't know what we would have done without her kindness." The conversations continued like this throughout the afternoon, public acknowledgement of their connection, careful and proper, but unmistakably there. People noticed. Some seemed pleased, others surprised, a few disapproving, but no one could claim there was anything improper about their behavior. As the social wound down and families began departing, Nora walked with Caleb to his sleigh. They stood in the cold afternoon, Grace sleeping between them in Caleb's arms, neither quite ready to say goodbye. "You did well today," Nora said quietly. "Patient with everyone, even the nosy ones." "Was I being courted or interviewed?" Caleb asked with a wry smile. "Both, I think. That's how it works in small towns. Everything's everyone's business." She reached out to adjust Grace's blanket, her fingers brushing against Caleb's hand. "But we made a good start. People saw us together, saw that we're not hiding anything. When can I see you again? Really see you, not just in front of the whole town." "Tomorrow, if you want. I could come by after church, help with Grace. It would be expected now. People will understand that I'm helping you, that there's a practical reason for my visits." And beyond the practical reason, Nora's smile was answer enough. "Beyond that, we're two people getting to know each other, properly, respectfully, with no secrets between us or the community. That's how this has to work, Caleb." "I know." He did know, even if part of him chafed at the restrictions. "Tomorrow, then." He drove home as the sun set, painting the snow in shades of rose and gold, and felt something he hadn't felt since before Elena died, genuine excitement for the future. Not the grief-shadowed obligation to keep living for Grace's sake, but actual anticipation for what might come. That night he sat with Grace and told her about her mother, about Elena's courage and kindness, about how much she'd wanted this baby, about the love that had created her. And then, feeling like he needed Elena's blessing, even though he knew logically that the dead couldn't give permission, he spoke to the ghost of his wife. "I hope you'd understand," he said softly. "I hope you'd approve. Nora's not trying to replace you, no one could. But she's good and kind, and she loves Grace, and I'm starting to love her too. Is that wrong? Am I betraying your memory?" The cabin was silent except for Grace's breathing and the wind outside. No divine answer came, no sign from beyond. But Caleb thought about that promise Elena had extracted from him. Find joy. Find love again. Don't lock yourself away. And he chose to believe that this was what she'd meant. That she'd known, somehow, that he'd need someone to pull him back from the edge of grief, that she'd want him to choose life over mourning, connection over isolation. "Thank you," he whispered, to Elena's memory, and to whatever force had sent Nora through that blizzard. "Thank you for everything." Spring came to Wyoming that year with unusual gentleness, as if the land itself was trying to heal after the harsh winter that had tested them all. The snow melted gradually rather than in the violent floods that sometimes accompanied the thaw, and wildflowers began pushing through the softening earth weeks earlier than usual. Caleb found himself noticing these things again, the way morning light caught the dewdrops on new grass, the return of birdsong to the meadows, the sweetness in the air that spoke of renewal and possibility. Grace was nearly 5 months old now, and the changes in her were remarkable. She could sit up with support, laugh at silly faces, reach deliberately for objects she wanted. Her personality was emerging too, stubborn like Elena, but with a sunny disposition that seemed entirely her own. When Nora visited, which she did every Sunday and often on Wednesday evenings after school let out, Grace would kick her legs excitedly and make cooing sounds that were clearly meant as greetings. "She knows you," Caleb observed one warm April afternoon as Grace practically lunged out of his arms toward Nora. "She gets more excited when you arrive than she does for anyone else." "That's because I make excellent silly faces," Nora replied, scooping Grace up and pressing kisses to her cheeks. "Isn't that right, sweetheart? I make the best silly faces in all of Wyoming." Grace grabbed Nora's nose and squealed with delight, and Caleb felt his heart swell with an emotion that was becoming increasingly familiar, a mixture of love and gratitude and wonder at how his life had transformed in just a few short months. The courtship, as they had agreed to call it, was progressing slowly but steadily. They attended church socials together, sat side by side during Sunday services, took walks through town with Grace in a pram that Mr. Henderson had discovered in his barn and refurbished. They were proper and careful, always mindful of appearances, never alone for long enough to invite scandal. But in the quiet moments between propriety and performance, they were learning each other. Caleb discovered that Nora had a wicked sense of humor that emerged when she was comfortable, that she could argue politics with passion and intelligence, that she sang off-key when she thought no one was listening. Nora learned that Caleb had a gift for storytelling, that he could be surprisingly tender with Grace while still maintaining the rough competence of a working man, that grief had softened him in ways that made him more open, more willing to be vulnerable. They talked about Elena often. Nora insisted on hearing stories about Caleb's late wife, wanted to know what Elena had been like, what dreams she'd held, what kind of mother she would have been. At first, Caleb had worried these conversations might create awkwardness or jealousy, but Nora approached them with such genuine warmth that they became a form of healing. "Tell me about your wedding day," Nora said one evening as they sat on Caleb's porch watching the sunset. Grace was asleep inside, and for once they had a rare moment of privacy. Mrs. Henderson had agreed to wait an extra hour before fetching Nora, a small concession to the fact that their relationship was becoming more serious. "It was smaller than Elena wanted," Caleb began, the memory coming easily now without the sharp edge of pain. "We couldn't afford much, and her family didn't attend. They'd never approved of her marrying a cowboy and moving west. But the church was full anyway, packed with neighbors and friends we'd made in just the few months since we'd arrived. Mrs. Henderson made the cake, Mr. Johansson played fiddle, and Elena—" He smiled at the memory. Elena wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit. It was ivory lace, old-fashioned even then, but she looked beautiful. When I saw her coming down the aisle, I thought my heart might stop. "She sounds wonderful," Nora said softly. "She was. And she would have liked you, I think, would have appreciated your strength, your independence. Elena always said women needed to be more than just wives and mothers, that we had minds and talents that deserved recognition. She was ahead of her time." "She was." Caleb turned to look at Nora, her profile gilded by the setting sun. "I need you to know something. What I feel for you. It's not about replacing Elena or forgetting her. She'll always be Grace's mother, always be my first love. But that doesn't mean there isn't room in my heart for you. Love doesn't work like a finite resource that runs out." Nora reached over and took his hand, a gesture that still felt daring even after months of careful courtship. "I know, and I don't want to replace her. I want to honor her memory while building something new, something that's ours." "Is that what you want? Something that's ours?" Caleb's heart was pounding, but he needed to hear her say it clearly. "Yes." Nora met his eyes directly. "I want a life with you, Caleb. With you and Grace. I want to wake up in that cabin and make breakfast while you tend the animals. I want to teach Grace her letters and watch her grow. I want to build something lasting, something real. I want—" She paused, gathering courage. "I want to be your wife." The words hung between them, bold and honest. Caleb felt a rush of joy so intense it was almost painful. He'd been hoping, planning, but hadn't been sure if Nora was ready for that commitment. "I was going to ask you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been trying to find the right moment, the right words. I even have a ring, my mother's ring, the one I was going to give Elena, but she wanted her own mother's dress and ring instead, wanted that connection to her family. I've been carrying it around for weeks, waiting for what? A sign from heaven? A perfect sunset? Caleb Monroe, if there's one thing we should have learned by now, it's that life doesn't wait for perfect moments." Nora was smiling, tears gathering in her eyes. "Ask me now, ask me here, on this porch where we've spent so many evenings talking and dreaming and becoming us." Caleb stood, pulling her to her feet, and then, feeling both foolish and absolutely certain, he dropped to one knee. From his pocket, he drew out the simple gold band that had belonged to his mother, a woman he barely remembered, but whose love he'd felt through his father's stories. "Nora Bennett, you walked through a blizzard to save my daughter's life, and in doing so, you saved mine. You've taught me how to be a father, shown me that grief and joy can coexist, helped me believe in the possibility of a future worth living. I don't have much to offer, just a small cabin, a working farm, and a baby who will probably keep us up at night for years to come. But I can promise you love, partnership, and a life built on honesty and respect. Will you marry me? Will you make this family whole?" Nora was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face as she nodded. "Yes. God, yes, Caleb. I'll marry you." He stood and slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. as if it had been waiting all these years for her hand. Then, for the first time since that night in the cabin, when they'd both admitted their feelings, he kissed her. It was gentle and careful, mindful of propriety even in this private moment, but it was also full of promise and possibility. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and grinning, Nora laughed through her tears. Mrs. Henderson is going to be insufferable about this. She's been predicting it for months. Let her be insufferable. She earned the right. Caleb pulled Nora close, wrapping his arms around her. When? When can we marry? Soon. June, maybe. That gives us time to plan something proper, to let people see that we're serious about doing this right. June, Caleb agreed, though every day between now and then is going to feel like a year. They heard the sound of wagon wheels approaching. Mr. Henderson, right on schedule. Nora quickly wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself, but her joy was too obvious to hide. When Mr. Henderson saw their faces and the ring glinting on Nora's finger, his weathered face broke into a rare smile. About damn time, he said gruffly. Wife's been saying you two were meant for each other since January. Congratulations, both of you. The news spread through Pine Hollow Valley with the speed of wildfire. By the next Sunday's church service, everyone knew that the widower Caleb Monroe and schoolteacher Nora Bennett were engaged to be married. The reaction was largely positive. People had watched their careful courtship, had seen how Nora brought light back into Caleb's life, how devoted she was to little Grace. There were a few disapproving murmurs about the speed of the engagement, whispers about propriety and respect for the dead, but these were drowned out by genuine happiness for the couple. Mrs. Morrison at the general store insisted on hosting a small engagement party. Mrs. Henderson took charge of wedding plans with the enthusiasm of a general marshalling troops. The women of the church promised to help with food and decorations. Even Mr. Johansson, who rarely showed emotion about anything other than his cattle, offered to play fiddle at the reception. Through it all, Caleb felt as if he was walking through a dream. The darkness that had consumed him after Elena's death had lifted, replaced by something warm and vital. He still grieved. There were moments when he'd see Grace do something new and wish Elena could witness it, times when a memory would ambush him with sudden sorrow. But the grief no longer defined him. It was part of his story, a chapter that had shaped him, but it wasn't the whole book. One evening in late May, as he and Nora sat on his porch watching Grace play with a soft cloth doll Nora had sewn, Caleb voiced a fear that had been nagging at him. Do you ever worry that I'm not over Elena? That I'm bringing too much baggage into this marriage? Nora was quiet for a moment, watching Grace with thoughtful eyes. Everyone brings baggage into a marriage, Caleb. I bring my broken engagement, my complicated relationship with my family, my own fears and insecurities. You bring your grief for Elena, your worries about being a good father, your adjustment to this new life. That's not a flaw. That's being human. But what if I compare you to her? What if I... Then we'll talk about it. Nora turned to face him, her expression serious but not unkind. Marriage isn't about being perfect or having no past. It's about choosing each day to build something together, to be honest about our struggles, to support each other through the hard times. I know you loved Elena. I know you still love her in a way. And I'm not threatened by that, because what we have is different. It doesn't diminish what you had with her. It stands on its own. How did you get so wise? Heartbreak and hard lessons, Nora said with a wry smile. Plus, my mother used to say that the couples who made it weren't the ones who never fought or struggled. They were the ones who fought fair and struggled together. Grace chose that moment to throw her doll off the porch, then look up at them with an expression of such comic surprise that both adults burst out laughing. Caleb retrieved the doll and handed it back, only to have Grace immediately throw it again. She's testing us, Nora observed, seeing if we'll keep playing the game. She's her mother's daughter, stubborn and determined. Caleb retrieved the doll again. And probably going to be brilliant and strong-willed and a handful. Good, Nora said firmly. The world needs more women who know their own minds and aren't afraid to use them. We'll raise her to be exactly that. The we in that sentence settled something deep in Caleb's chest. We. A family. Not just him struggling alone, but partners raising this child together, building a life together, facing whatever came together. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Nora finished out the school year, promising her students she'd return in the fall as Mrs. Monroe. She moved her few possessions from the Henderson house to the cabin, transforming it gradually into a space that reflected both of them. She hung curtains in the windows, arranged wildflowers in mason jars, brought books and small touches that made the place feel less like a bachelor's dwelling and more like a home. Grace, now 6 months old, was thriving. She could sit up on her own, was starting to babble in ways that almost sounded like words, could grab objects with increasing accuracy. She'd developed a particular attachment to Nora, reaching for her whenever she entered a room, settling more quickly in her arms than anyone else's. "She's going to call you Mama," Caleb said one evening as he watched Nora rock Grace to sleep. "Is that all right? I don't want to erase Elena's memory, but Grace won't remember her, and you're the one who—" "It's more than all right," Nora said softly, her eyes on the baby in her arms. "Elena gave Grace life, and I'll make sure Grace knows that, knows about her first mother and how much she was loved. But yes, I hope she'll call me Mama. I hope she'll let me be that for her." The wedding took place on a perfect June afternoon, with the valley in full bloom and the sky an impossible shade of blue. The small church was packed with neighbors and friends, the same community that had supported Caleb through Elena's death and watched his slow return to life. Nora wore a simple cream-colored dress that Mrs. Henderson had helped her sew, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Grace had helped pick that morning by mostly grabbing at them and giggling. Mrs. Patterson held Grace during the ceremony, but the baby's eyes were fixed on Nora throughout, as if she understood somehow that this day was important. When Reverend Walsh pronounced them husband and wife, and Caleb kissed his new bride with more enthusiasm than strict propriety allowed, Grace let out a delighted squeal that made the entire congregation laugh. The reception was held in the churchyard, with tables laden with food that the community women had prepared. Mr. Johansson played fiddle, and people danced on the grass. Children ran wild, freed from church behavior. And Caleb and Nora moved through it all in a happy daze, accepting congratulations and well wishes, stealing moments together whenever they could. At one point, Caleb found himself alone with Mr. Henderson, who pressed a glass of whiskey into his hand, smuggled in despite the church's official prohibition. "To your health," the old man said, raising his own glass. "And to your happiness. You're a lucky man, Monroe. Don't forget it." "I won't," Caleb promised. "Mr. Henderson, I wanted to thank you for sending Nora that night in the storm, for supporting us through everything, for—" "Don't thank me. Thank my wife. She's the one who saw what you needed before you knew yourself." Henderson took a sip of whiskey, his eyes moving to where Nora was dancing with Grace in her arms. "That's a good woman you're marrying. Treat her right." "I intend to." "See that you do. She's had enough heartbreak already. Give her joy, Monroe. Give her the life she deserves." "That's my plan." Caleb watched his wife. His wife, the word still felt foreign and wonderful, spinning Grace around while the baby laughed. "That's exactly my plan." As the sun began to set and the party showed no signs of slowing, Caleb and Nora slipped away with Grace. They'd declined offers of a wedding trip, preferring to start their married life immediately in the cabin that would now be their shared home. Besides, neither wanted to be away from Grace for any extended period. The cabin had been transformed in their absence. The church women, led by Mrs. Henderson, had decorated it with ribbons and flowers, had prepared a cold supper and left it covered on the table, had even made up the bed with fresh linens. A note from Mrs. Henderson read simply, "Welcome home to your new life together." Nora stood in the middle of the main room, turning slowly to take it all in, and Caleb saw tears gathering in her eyes. "What's wrong?" he asked, immediately concerned. "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right." She wiped at her eyes, laughing at herself. "I'm just overwhelmed. 6 months ago, I was alone, living in someone else's house, teaching other people's children and wondering if this was all my life would ever be. And now I have a husband, a daughter, a home. It's more than I dared hope for." Caleb crossed to her, Grace between them, and wrapped his free arm around Nora's shoulders. "You gave me that same gift. 6 months ago, I was a broken man holding a starving baby, ready to give up. And then you knocked on my door." "The best decision I ever made," Nora murmured, leaning into him. Grace, perhaps sensing the emotional moment, reached out and grabbed both their faces with her small hands, pulling them together until their foreheads touched. They stayed like that for a long moment. The three of them connected, a family forged not by blood alone, but by choice and chance and the mysterious workings of grace. The months that followed were an education in the rhythms of married life. Caleb and Nora learned each other's habits and quirks, navigated the small frustrations and larger joys of sharing space and responsibilities. Nora returned to teaching in the fall, and they worked out a system where Caleb cared for Grace during school hours, bringing her to the schoolhouse at lunchtime so Nora could nurse her. She'd managed to induce lactation with Grace's help and a visiting midwife's guidance, a gift that felt like a small miracle. Grace grew and changed, reaching each milestone with determination. She crawled at 7 months, pulled herself up at 9, took her first wobbling steps at 11 months. By her first birthday, she was toddling around the cabin, getting into everything, keeping both parents constantly on their toes. They celebrated that first birthday with a small party, just the Hendersons, the Johansons, a few families from town. Mrs. Henderson baked a cake, and Grace's face when she tasted frosting for the first time was a study in pure joy that made all the adults laugh. Elena would have loved this, Caleb said to Nora that night, after everyone had left and Grace was finally asleep, exhausted from excitement. Would have loved seeing her so happy, so healthy. Tell me about her, Nora said, as she often did. Tell me something I don't know yet. Caleb thought for a moment. She used to sing when she cooked. Terribly, off-key, but with such enthusiasm that it didn't matter. And she had this way of finding beauty in small things, a bird's nest, the pattern of frost on the window, the way light fell through the trees. She taught me to notice those things, to appreciate them. I see her in Grace, Nora observed, in the way she approaches the world with such curiosity, such determination. That's a gift Elena gave her. And you're giving her different gifts. Patience, gentleness, the love of learning. She's lucky to have had both of you as mothers. Nora squeezed his hand, understanding what he was really saying, that he'd found a way to honor Elena's memory while building a new life, that love didn't have to be either or, but could be expansive enough to hold past and present together. Winter came again, as it always did in Wyoming, but this year, Caleb faced it without fear. The cabin was well stocked with food and supplies. The animals were healthy and strong. And most importantly, he wasn't alone. When the first big storm hit in January, almost exactly a year after the night Nora had first knocked on his door, they weathered it together, playing with Grace by the fire, telling stories, making plans for the spring. Do you ever think about that night? Caleb asked as they sat watching snow pile up outside the windows. Wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come. I try not to, Nora admitted. The thought of you and Grace alone, struggling, possibly. She shuddered. I'm just grateful Mrs. Henderson sent me. Grateful I was brave enough or foolish enough to go. Both, Caleb said with a smile. Definitely both. Grace, now 14 months old and walking confidently, toddled over with a wooden block, presenting it to Nora with great solemnity. Mama, she said clearly, not her first word that had been Papa, but the one that never failed to make Nora's eyes mist over. Yes, sweetheart, that's a beautiful block, Nora said, accepting it with appropriate reverence. Thank you for sharing with Mama. Grace beamed and immediately went to find another block to present, this time to Caleb. He accepted it with the same seriousness, making her giggle. This is good, Caleb said softly, watching his daughter play. This life we've built, it's good. It is, Nora agreed. Better than good. It's everything I never knew I needed. As winter gradually loosened its grip and spring approached again, Nora came to Caleb with news that would change everything once more. She was pregnant. They would have a second child by late fall, a sibling for Grace, a new life to love and nurture. Are you happy? Nora asked nervously, watching his face for his reaction. Happy? Caleb pulled her into his arms, holding her close. Nora, I'm terrified and thrilled and grateful beyond words. Yes, I'm happy. Are you? Scared, she admitted. After what happened to Elena, I can't help but worry. But also excited. Grace needs a sibling, and I want to give you more children, build the family we've both dreamed of. We'll get the best midwife, take every precaution, do everything right, Caleb promised. You're not going through this alone. And he kept that promise. When Nora's time came in November, he was there beside her, holding her hand through every contraction, refusing to leave even when the midwife suggested he wait outside. Grace stayed with the Hendersons, and when the baby, a boy they named James, after Nora's youngest brother, finally arrived after a long but uncomplicated labor, Caleb wept with relief and joy. Nora recovered well, and within days was up and moving around, determined to prove that childbirth didn't have to be a death sentence. Grace was fascinated by her new brother, wanting to touch him constantly, bring him toys, help with everything. Gentle, Grace, Nora would remind her. Baby James is very small. We have to be gentle. Grace would nod seriously and then immediately try to stick her finger in James's mouth, making both parents laugh. The years that followed brought their share of challenges: harsh winters and dry summers, crop failures and animal losses, the constant struggle of frontier life. But they faced them together, Caleb and Nora and their growing family. 2 more children followed James, another boy and then a girl, and the small cabin had to be expanded room by room until it was a proper house. Nora continued teaching when she could, taking breaks for pregnancies and newborns, but always returning to the schoolhouse. Her students loved her, and several went on to college thanks to her encouragement and preparation. She became known throughout the valley as a fierce advocate for education, arguing at town meetings for better supplies and longer school years. Caleb built up the farm until it was one of the most productive in the area. He hired help during busy seasons, taught his sons the value of hard work and fair dealing. He served on the church council and helped mediate disputes between neighbors. He became a man the community respected, no longer just the grieving widower, but a pillar of Pine Hollow Valley. Grace grew into a beautiful, strong-willed girl who had her birth mother's determination and her father's steady strength, but also Nora's love of learning and fierce independence. On her 10th birthday, Caleb told her the full story of her birth, about Elena's sacrifice, about the storm, about Nora's brave journey. Grace listened with wide eyes, then threw her arms around Nora. "Thank you for saving Papa and me," she whispered. "Thank you for being my mama." "Thank you for letting me," Nora replied, her voice thick with emotion. Every year on the anniversary of that first storm, the night Nora had knocked on Caleb's door, the family observed a quiet tradition. They would pack a basket with milk, bread, applesauce, and whatever else they had to spare, and they would deliver it to some family in the valley who was struggling. Sometimes it was a new widow, sometimes a family hit by illness or misfortune, sometimes just neighbors who'd fallen on hard times. "We're paying forward the kindness," Nora would explain to the children, keeping the circle going. Grace, as the oldest, took this tradition most seriously. By the time she was 15, she'd started organizing her siblings and schoolmates to help more families, expanding the gesture beyond just one day. She called it the Storm Basket Brigade, and it became a valley-wide initiative that continued for generations. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Caleb and Nora sat on their porch, much expanded from the simple stoop of their early days, and watched their children play in the yard. Grace was home from her teaching position in Cheyenne, where she'd followed in Nora's footsteps. James was preparing to take over the farm. The younger children were still at home, filling the house with noise and life. "Do you ever miss Boston?" Caleb asked, a question he'd never dared voice before. Nora was quiet for a moment, considering. "I miss my siblings sometimes. Wish they could know their nieces and nephews. But miss the life I had there? No. That woman who was so desperate to please, so willing to make herself small, I don't miss her at all. Coming west, meeting you, building this life, it made me into who I was meant to be. I think you were always this person. You just needed the space to become her." "Maybe." Nora leaned her head on his shoulder. "Do you still think about Elena?" "Sometimes. Usually when Grace does something that reminds me of her, a gesture, an expression, but it doesn't hurt the way it used to. Now it feels more like gratitude. For the time we had, for Grace, for how that chapter of my life led to this one." "That's good. That's healthy." Nora paused, then added, "She'd be proud of you, you know, of the father you became, the man you are, of how you chose life over grief." "We chose it together," Caleb corrected. "You knocked on my door when I'd given up hope. You showed me how to live again. And you let me in. That took courage too. Letting someone help, letting someone see you at your worst, allowing new love even while grieving old love. We saved each other, Caleb. That's what people do when they're meant to be together. As the sun set over the valley, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and pink, their children's laughter echoing from the yard, Caleb Monroe thought about the journey that had brought him here. From the darkest moment of his life, sitting in a snowbound cabin with a starving baby, ready to surrender to despair, to this moment of almost perfect contentment. It had been Elena's death that brought Nora into his life, but it was Grace's need that had kept her there, and it was their own courage and choice that had built this family. He thought about that knock in the storm, about Nora standing on his threshold covered in snow, carrying a basket and an offer of hope. He thought about all the small decisions and lucky chances that had led them both to that moment. Nora's broken engagement, his journey west with Elena, Mrs. Henderson's concern, the storm itself. Remove any single element and the whole story would have unfolded differently. But it had unfolded exactly as it did. And looking at his wife beside him, at his children playing in the yard they'd built together, at the life they'd created from grief and grace and stubborn determination, Caleb couldn't imagine it any other way. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" "For knocking, for staying, for choosing us." Nora smiled and kissed his cheek. "Thank you for opening the door, for letting us build this, for giving me a family and a home and a purpose." Grace called out from the yard, asking if dinner was ready, and Nora stood to answer her. But she paused, looking back at Caleb with eyes that still held the same warmth and understanding that had drawn him to her in those dark early days. "We did good, didn't we?" she asked. "With all of this, the children, the farm, the life. We did good." "We did great," Caleb replied. "Better than I ever dreamed possible." She went inside then, calling the children to wash up for dinner, and Caleb sat for a moment longer in the gathering dusk. Somewhere in the house he could hear Nora singing, still slightly off-key, just like Elena used to be, and the sound filled him with contentment so deep it was almost painful. He thought about Elena, sending her a silent message of gratitude and love across whatever distance separated them. He hoped she knew that her daughter had grown up strong and loved, that her husband had found happiness again without forgetting her, that the sacrifice of her life had rippled outward in ways she couldn't have imagined, not just in Grace, but in the family they'd built, the community they'd strengthened, the kindness they'd passed forward year after year. And he thought about Nora, his second chance, his partner, the woman who'd been brave enough to walk through a blizzard and strong enough to wait patiently while he learned how to love again. She'd given him back his life, had given Grace a mother, had filled their home with warmth and laughter and purpose. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of approaching autumn, and Caleb stood to go inside. Through the window he could see his family gathering around the table, Nora lighting the lamps, Grace helping the younger children into their seats, James saying something that made everyone laugh. It was an ordinary moment, unremarkable in its domesticity, but to Caleb it was everything. He'd been a cowboy who'd lost his way, drowning in grief and fear, and the terrible responsibility of a helpless infant. He'd been saved by a knock in the storm, by a woman's courage, by the slow accumulation of shared meals and quiet conversations and small acts of care. And from that desperate beginning, he'd built something lasting, a family, a legacy, a life defined not by loss but by love. As Caleb Monroe stepped across the threshold into the warm, lamp-lit house where his family waited, he sent one final thought into the universe, to Elena, to fate, to whatever force had orchestrated the miracle of that snowy night. He thought about how the worst moments of our lives sometimes contain the seeds of our salvation, how grace arrives in unexpected forms, how love, real love, isn't diminished by division but multiplied by sharing. The door closed behind him, shutting out the darkness, and inside there was light and warmth and the beautiful, ordinary chaos of family life. Outside, the first stars were emerging in the Wyoming sky, cold and distant, but undeniably beautiful. And in the valley below, other families were sitting down to their own dinners, living their own stories, some of them probably holding baskets that had appeared mysteriously on their doorsteps. Milk and bread and applesauce, an anonymous gift, a reminder that in this harsh and beautiful land, nobody had to face the darkness alone. The kindness that had saved Caleb Monroe continued its journey outward, touching lives he'd never know, creating ripples that would extend far beyond his lifetime. And somewhere, he liked to imagine, Elena and all the other departed souls who'd loved and lost and sacrificed were watching with approval, their legacies living on not in monuments or grand gestures, but in the simple, essential act of one person helping another through the storm.